There had been strong signals that the military were usurping the civil responsibility for foreign policy as early as 1992. The Pentagon, under the supervision of Paul Wolfowitz, produced a document labeled Defense Planning Guidance, Post-Cold War Strategy, which later became known as a Plan for a New American Century. It was a very aggressive blueprint for military expansion that included a number of proposed wars in the Middle East. When the original draft was leaked to the New York Times in March 1992, the reaction was so negative that it had to be withdrawn and rewritten in more acceptable language. One of the suggestions in the original document was that the American people might be difficult to sell on such an aggressive interventionist policy in the absence of some incident, like another Pearl Harbor. The principal authors became key members of the George W. Bush administration, thanks largely to Dick Cheney and his transformation team. In due course, they got their incident like Pearl Harbor, when 2 airplanes flew into towers at the Trade Center in New York on September the 11th, 2001. The press dutifully reported what had happened, but no investigative reporters were assigned to determine how 2 planes, with neither the kinetic nor heat energy necessary to bring down even 1 building, were responsible for the destruction of 5. 1,000 architects and engineers were convinced that the official explanation was incorrect. The late Major General retired, Albert Stubelbein III, former chief of all of the U.S. Army intelligence services around the world, at his wife's suggestion, connected the dots and came to the very unhappy conclusion that the public had been duped. Totally convincing is Dr. Judy Wood's 500-page book entitled Where Did the Towers Go? Evidence of Directed Free Energy Technology on 9/11. She doesn't point fingers. She merely says, look at the evidence. And that advice should have been taken by people in high places. Meanwhile, the negative consequences for Americans and citizens of the world is probably unequaled in all of recorded history. In the real world of near total secrecy, the military-industrial intelligence group used the incident to justify a 100% increase in defense expenditures at a time when they were already twice as great as necessary to more than cope with any possible enemy. The Pentagon became careless in financial record keeping, to the point where Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld admitted $2 trillion were missing and unaccounted for. More recently, the figure for missing funds has escalated to 21 trillion. That figure was 21 trillion, not 21 billion. No defense department could get away with that in a democracy. Meanwhile, in the real world of near total secrecy of the shadow government or cabal or military-industrial intelligence group, whatever you want to call it, has built up military and lethal force short of war, unprecedented in the recorded history of planet Earth.
I have looked at it. You know, I have bigger fish to fry. 9/11 was terrible. We lost 3,000 people. It led to 2 huge wars and trillions of dollars. I will tell you this. I'm not going to get into specifics. I mentioned a gentleman named Richard Foch, third highest guy, Richard Foch at the Naval Research Labs. He was in meetings with the then Vice President of the United States, Cheney. And he said, absolutely it was known about in advance, and there was involvement at that level. And he told me, and I have witnesses, multiple witnesses to this, that if he were to speak of this, now he's passed away, that he, his wife, his children, and his grandchildren would all be killed. That's all I'm going to say on the 9/11 issue. But there is a lot to that story. I've never shared publicly what I just said, but the man has passed away. So it's not hard to, and I think most people get into these grand conspiracy theories. Basically, all you have to do is stand down. There's constant threat. There is terrorism out there. And you don't even have to hoax an event in that case. You just have to stand down the systems that would have intercepted it. You understand what I'm saying? So it's like when you're doing a code blue, boom, clear. You say clear before you do the electric shock. So you just clear the system, let it come in and hit. Now, what I think happened on 9/11 is more like what I just described. And I have very good reason to believe that, because someone of that integrity and rank had a front row seat and knew about it. And I've never spoken of this before right now, but I think that it's disturbing. It's enraging, but it's a minor rounding error compared to what's coming if we don't end this cartel's hegemony on the secrecy related to UFOs, ETs, what have you. 9/11 is going to be a very minor blip on the screen. So that's my warning to people. You can take it or not, but I've known what you just asked about since it happened. My whole security team lit up like you wouldn't believe when that happened. Yes, yes, ma'am.
And so did that receive widespread press? No, no. And what about 9/11? The Bush administration, the top people in the Bush administration were well aware that the attack on the towers was going to take place weeks before it happened. Isn't that news? You would think so. Have you read about it in any of the papers? Have you heard them talk about it on any of the big television networks or small television networks? No. You probably have heard people say, well, that's just, conspiracy theory.
Jesse Ventura has come out about it.
Yes, there are books coming out, and in my latest book, The Money Mafia, I quote Dr. Judy Woods, who did the most thorough investigation. It is that thick. And she points out, for example, there were only 2 little planes hit 2 of the towers. And yet, I can't remember whether it's 5 or 7. There were 5 buildings at least that went down. Now, how do you knock down 5 buildings with 2 jets? Neither one of which had enough thermal energy or kinetic energy to bring down one of those buildings. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that. You just have to be an engineer who knows a little bit, or an architect, and 1,000 of them, 1,000, 1000 architects and engineers have come out and signed a document that said the official report was not the truth, was not, in fact, what happened. Now that's news, but have you seen that reported? Only in what we call the alternate press, the kind that some of us get our news from. So as I insist, and I think it's the saddest thing that I know. And recently I saw a YouTube of a former FBI officer saying that his job was to buy the press. And he went into it chapter and verse of how they would approach a paper and offer them cash, offer all sorts of good correspondence cash in order to write stories that repudiated what was really going on. And this is hard to...
Interesting. Just a couple of 9/11 details. one of them, this is a shot of a NASA satellite taking a picture of the smoke here coming out from the buildings after the planes hit them, and the incredible strange debris, the powderization and all the rest, which implied some kind of advanced weaponry was being used there. They had these satellites trained, of course, on the surface, as they always do. They certainly had them by 2001. Donald Rumsfeld, who's the defense secretary at the time, who recently passed away, he said something very interesting, which is that he didn't know the towers had been hit until 15 minutes after it happened. And then, of course, he was seen on the lawn of the Pentagon carrying out a stretcher. The Secretary of Defense, there's real protocols when there's a terrorist attack. He can't be seen publicly. He's surrounded by bodyguards. He's taken into an underground shelter, all this kind of stuff. But instead, he was on the Pentagon lawn carrying a stretcher. And he also said, you know, those planes hit, but I didn't find out about it. Well, I guess he didn't even have a television. So in another interview later on, someone called in, it was like 2005, 2006, and he had put a book out, you know, being like The Horror of 9/11 or something. And just to show his contempt for his audience and the general contempt of the government for the governed, a caller called in and said, hey, you know, what about Building 7? And he said, what's Building 7? What's Building 7? Well, Building 7 is the building that came down, even though it wasn't hit by any planes. That was right there, the towers. But it wasn't hit by the towers, and it wasn't hit by any planes, but it went down anyway. But Rumsfeld, good old Rummy's response. You know, it's interesting. It's a strange step to go from being the defense secretary in 1976, take 25 years off, be a pharmaceutical executive, but in the meantime, set up COG, then become the defense secretary in 2001 when you're going to use COG for the first time. I mean, it actually had been used, but first time on the record that COG has been used was during 9/11. A lot of these stories are coming out now, and it is to pretend that we're going to get, just like with the Kennedy assassination, that you'll get the real story, and it's what the CIA knew before 9/11, new details. And they don't really let any of those new details out. But looking on is Michael Hayden, General Hayden, who was the head of the NSA and an all-around psychopath. And he recently tweeted out himself that, you know, all those people that didn't agree with the administration and were anti-vax should be shipped out to Afghanistan. Psychopaths go on and publicly show themselves. I mean, I think they should all get Twitter accounts. Okay, I found these a couple of interesting quotes from firemen during 9/11 that kind of give us, I think, just a few things to reflect on. So I want to read these. FDNY firefighter John Cohn, who was in the South Tower, recalls he had called his father and said, quote, I finally got through to my father and said, I'm alive. I just wanted to tell you, go to church, I'm alive. I just so narrowly escaped this thing. He said, where were you? You were there? I said, yeah, I was right there when it blew up. He said, you were there when the planes hit? I said, no, I was there when it exploded. The building exploded. He said, you mean when it fell down? I said, no, when it exploded. I totally thought it had been blown up. That's just the perspective of looking at it. It seemed to have exploded out. This is one of the interesting testimonies that came out that was not supposed to come out. I'm going to show you why. On September 11th, 2001, Thomas von Essen, the fire commissioner of New York City, ordered that oral histories be gathered from first responders, firefighters, and medical workers, like that one. He wanted to preserve the accounts of what they experienced at the World Trade Center in the weeks and months following 9/11. 503 oral histories were taken. However, they were never released to the public. The 2002 mayor of New York City, Michael Bloomberg, refused to have them released. We know Bloomberg real well. For some reason, they didn't want that little piece out. During the 9/11 Commission, and let's see if I can tie in this Governor Kane, Leslie Kane UFO piece with this. The 9/11 Commission called in Bush and Cheney for testimony, and they said, you can't do it. We're not going to testify. And they said, you have to, pressure built and all the rest of it. And they said, okay, we'll testify, but not under oath. And we have to be together so that we keep our story straight. The other guy doesn't screw up the story. The meeting with Bush and Cheney took place in secret, April 29th, 2004. It was not held under oath. No transcript was made available of their conversation with the commissioners. Nothing was learned about why the president remained at an elementary school during the attacks. Nothing was learned about what the president knew regarding foreign intelligence agencies forewarning the U.S. Nothing was learned about why the president had authorized America to prepare for war against Afghanistan in the days and weeks prior to the attacks of September 11th. They were already going to war with Afghanistan. And we still don't know any of those answers. So in fact, the problem over and over again in our country of the United States is accountability. From the Kennedy assassination, no accountability of the CIA organizing his assassination. Watergate. They don't even know what, we've gone through a number of different things about what Watergate was about. The official story is absurd. That they were, just going in to bug the office. And it's, they do that all the time. Why would you send 5 ex-CIA guys and 2 Cuban exiles in there to do something like that? So very, very strange. 9/11, no answers to any of that. But we did get a much more fascist-oriented society as a result with the Patriot Act, warrantless wiretapping, torture, which they supposedly got rid of. And now those terrorists they held up as the Middle Eastern terrorists so we could go into places like Iraq and Afghanistan. Now it's all circled around, and anyone who's their domestic enemy is now a terrorist. And this is where we find ourselves in 2021. What we need to do is see that COG machine going into overdrive. And I want to point out the commander for COG now. This is Northcom commander. Of course, he's a general doing the job for Northcom, like any other general. I can't really say that one would be better than the other, but I can say that that structure they've been building for COG to take over for a long time. Northcom commander working to advance defense. This is from last week, and he's been doing a lot of press conferences, I've noticed. I've introduced General Van Herk before. The person, the general who had the job before him, he was very public during COVID. And, the Northcom commanders, they reside deep in those bunkers, and you never see them come out and give interviews. It just doesn't happen. His presence and Newsweek suddenly wanting to talk about COG, you couldn't talk about COG in open session in Congress. That's what it had been like. And you weren't allowed to mention it. And suddenly Newsweek was interested in saying, hey, COG, this guy could take over. And you had a lot of things like this, exclusive, inside the military's top secret plans if coronavirus cripples the government. Yeah, they were going to take over. They were thinking to themselves, well, we're going to have to oust Trump one way or another. Should we do it with this or just take the election? It's one of the two. And on Van Herk, again, the 4-star general who will command the U.S. if government is crippled by coronavirus. Military puts plans in place for extraordinary circumstances and martial law. That's the Daily Mail in the UK. They're talking about it openly. So that, if that happens, well, you heard about it in the Daily Mail, didn't you? Newsweek reports that U.S. military planners are looking at a range of radical hypotheticals around the coronavirus crisis. Should the country's top politicians be struck down by COVID-19 and civil government be incapacitated, martial law could be imposed. The combatant commander, the Northcom commander, Van Herk, for the United States would lead the country if Washington were crippled. Let me say it again. The combatant commander, that's the Northcom general, Van Herk, for the United States would lead the country if Washington were crippled or Stepford Biden stopped working. The scenario appears unlikely, but there are also current debates about whether armed forces could be allowed to exercise emergency authority. The military could possibly serve as a policing function if widespread violence breaks out due to food shortages or financial chaos caused by the coronavirus. You know, whenever they float things, just like I've asked people to pay attention to the UFO threat meme that's out there in the media, when they float these things around there, they're trial balloons. They're trying to see, how do people feel about this? Could we get away with it? So the fact that they're talking about it in relation to Van Herk taking over the country is pretty disturbing.
On September 10th, Donald Rumsfeld gave a press conference admitting to the $2.3 trillion. We thought he was trying to get ahead of the story because we knew it would blow on September 15th. Well, it never ran. Yes. It ran several weeks later, and we know what happened.
Yes, indeed.
Right, and here's what's interesting. If you look at the mortgage fraud involved, I believe, in the missing money story, many of those companies went down or got impacted, and many of the offices that were doing the investigation of those companies came down in the towers. And then, of course, whatever hit the Pentagon hit the office that was doing the...
Well, the auditors were in there, correct? All the paperwork, the auditors killed them all, basically. Right. Cruise missile, no doubt, something like that. Targeted, and they're gone.
But if you look
and
at
the OKC bill, remember? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, if you look at the records related to the missing money and because you said to me, how could you steal that much money? Securities fraud is how you steal that much money.
Oh.
So if you look at all the records that were blown up in the SEC, FBI, and those different offices, and as we know, suddenly, right after 9/11, there were massive settlements between the SEC and Department of Justice and the different securities firms. And, of course, many records were blown up. The Army, for several years, said they couldn't produce financial statements because their whole capacity blown up, which I don't begin to understand since it's supposed to be out in Ohio, but that's what they said. At that point, you had the guy running the Army who was a former executive of Enron.
This is astonishing, just
you can't
incredible.
Make this stuff up.
No.
But here's... I've never been able, it wasn't until Dr. Skidmore that I was able to get the capacity to really have someone go through, survey the work, and look at it from the point of view who's somebody who's a serious scholar in the area of...
Well, he and his grad students came to the rescue, for sure.
Yeah, no, that was definitely the cavalry. And because this is something that is so extraordinary and so big, it's too big certainly for one set of eyes. You need many smart people looking at it. I think the reason it hasn't gotten traction is people are afraid. What you're talking about is a budget, a federal budget, that is financing two civilizations and pretending one doesn't exist.
I have talked to people about this over the years.
But goddamn it, they didn't get shit done for the American people on this subject. Maybe behind the scenes, I'm not privy to everything. No one is, but maybe they really tried hard. I think they did, and they got thwarted every time. And 9/11 was the big one. They said, "Stop it, or we're going to start killing people en masse." And people reeled back because when I said, "Dad, that was a Tomahawk missile, wasn't it?" In the Pentagon, the hole in the Pentagon was not. He said, I will not talk about that with you. That's the one thing. He looked me in the eyes. That's the one thing I want. And which is, go research on your own. You're damn right it was a Tomahawk missile. Now figure out why. And so...
really starts to get there. The other piece, which is crucial, is Dr. Farrell's work on 9/11 in the book that he had there. About hidden systems of finance. I have the book, actually. There's a lot in here that I think is crucial, and it is hidden finance, rogue networks, and secret sorcery, the fascist international 9/11, the penetrated operations. And so in here, we have to say that Dr. Farrell already has the outline for this idea. And the outline is very much that there are pieces that are involved with a separate player operating at the deepest level of government. And one of the examples I think that he pulls out of there, which is so fascinating, is that at a certain point, President Bush, instead of flying back to DC, goes and makes a different stop. And the idea is that he's taking over control again of the nuclear arsenal, because somehow their whole thing, while they're doing 9/11, there's another operation that's come in and penetrated their 9/11 operation. And that's where you see that other player crisscross. And there's all kinds of confusion in relation to this. I've pointed out before with 9/11, just to give it a little context, that, you know, there's a couple of things about it that will always be problematic, regardless of how many answers they are. One is the FBI agent walking down the street and the passport comes flying out of nowhere and lands in front of him on a pile of rubble. And it's the passport for one of the terrorists. And he's like, aha, now we know who's behind this. And he gives that to the other FBI agent. And they're like, hey, you know what? He's connected with 19 other guys and we know who they all are. That kind of absurdity. And it's interesting too, because Peter Dale Scott mentioned to me that 4 of those 19 supposed hijackers, you know, would show up and contact the American authorities. And some of them were in Spain and other places, and said, hey, that's not me. Do you have someone using my name? Because I'm still alive. I'm over here. That, like, I don't know what that is. And so that's the first piece on that. And Professor Scott calls them designated culprits. And what he says about designated culprits, you can see it as a pattern. The same thing with Oswald, is that those people, just before their deep event is coming up, they get taken off all of these emergency roles and roles that, you know, potential assassins and things like that. And we know that shortly before the Kennedy assassination, Oswald was taken off the Secret Service watch list by the Central Intelligence Agency. And, you know, the idea of doing that when he's going to be in a building with the president's going by, it would be absurd. So obviously they've already decided Oswald's the designated patsy. Well, in the case of the hijackers, you got 19 of them. And guys like Muhammad Atta and all that, they need also that ability to run. So you have to, that's why later they're like, oh, you know, we had an intelligence failure and this intelligence network didn't talk to the FBI and we'll do a better job next time. You know, just let us get away with this one. And so it's that kind of absurdity. But this is something that Farrell.
Probably you all know about the Iraq War and how we, through the Vice President Cheney's office, cherry-picked intelligence so that Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, would go to the UN and talk about the fearsome weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein had. Now, you know, I'm no fan of Saddam Hussein. He was obviously a thug and a dictator, and they're all over the world. However, he did not have those weapons, and it was known he did not have them. However, it was enough to stampede the American people and the Congress into a disastrous war. And it was all based on knowingly false and hoaxed, in some cases, intelligence. Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, who had been chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, by the way, it wasn't like he wasn't familiar with military and intelligence operations, admitted later that he was deceived, and his chief of staff went on the record saying that they were deceived by an intelligence operation out of the West Wing run by the Vice President Cheney. Of course, that ship sailed a while back. I'll get into some things that happened there that will stun you. And with weapon electronic systems on satellites. But when we get into looking at how this runs, you also have to go all the way back to the era of Ronald Reagan. And I met with a colonel not long ago before he passed away named Colonel Homeland. And Colonel Homeland had been on a committee back in the Carter transition, late Carter years and early Ronald Reagan presidency, to convince the president of the need for the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars. And it wasn't really getting much traction as a policy initiative in terms of conventional geopolitical exigencies and requirements until they played the last card. And he admitted to me that they went in with cherry-picked and distorted information and convinced Ronald Reagan that there was an alien threat. And of course, that's reflected in his speech to the United Nations and a few other speeches where the president said, oh, wouldn't our job of uniting the world be easier if we could unite against a common threat, alien threat? So unfortunately, you had an actor from Hollywood and then a governor of California, Ronald Reagan, who was easy to move through cherry picking and spinning of information to go to the policy decision these classified projects wanted. This happens all the time in the Congress, in the White House, and in other capitals, because the people who run these unacknowledged special access projects, first and foremost, are masters of psychological warfare, psyops, and psychological and social engineering. Very good at it, extremely good at it. Now, these false flag operations, and I do like the term deceptive indication and warning, very military, very precise. By the way, you mentioned that to anyone who's in counterintelligence and military intelligence, they're going to know what it means. Why? Because this is nothing new. Do you think this is the first time this has happened? You ever heard of something called the Vietnam War? How many people heard of Vietnam War? Well, I was talking to a college graduate not long ago who'd never heard of Watergate or President Nixon. So, all right, so there was something called the Vietnam War, and nobody reads anymore. And during that period, we were of course first we had some advisors in there. Kennedy wanted to pull us out, was assassinated. Johnson was reluctant to expand, and so they hoaxed an event or exaggerated an event called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. So get your history books open, but you can Google it. This is mainstream stuff, not conspiracy theory. And the Gulf of Tonkin, basically what we did, we hoaxed and exaggerated the attack on our ships in the Gulf of Tonkin, there near Vietnam, so that it would cause outrage in the public, outrage in Congress, and it stampeded President Johnson into vastly expanding our presence in Vietnam, which of course enriched, guess who? The military, industrial, financial, gang-bankster complex. So trillions of dollars are at stake here. So, and it happened to cost 58,000 American lives and probably several million Southeast Asian lives on a misadventure that was completely based on a hoaxed or an exaggerated event. You ever heard of something called 9/11? Who was alive when that happened? Any children here not alive? I've talked to some people. Well, when 9/11 happened, I don't want to go too far into this, except to say I have a gentleman who was the third highest ranking man at the Naval Research Labs, who prior to 9/11, in the Vice President's office, Vice President Cheney's, saw all the plans for 9/11 prior to it occurring. He's deceased, since I'm talking about it now. I did not talk about it for years. And he was told, I used to stay at my home. He said, look, I was told my wife and my children, my grandchildren would be killed along with me if I ever mentioned this. He took it to his grave, gave me the information. God bless him, Rick Foch, who was a very high-ranking scientist, an aerospace figure in the Naval Research Labs, which is the biggest Department of Defense lab. So when 9/11 happened, which was about 4 or 5 months after the 2001 disclosure event, where we had hundreds of thousands of people contacting Congress to hold hearings on this issue, which of course when 9/11 happened, that fell way to the back burner very quickly. And they then said, well, we got to go get those guys in Afghanistan. Then they did something else, another false flag. They concocted false intelligence, yellow cake, remember the story yellow cake, uranium out of Africa. They made up all these stories. And they put poor Colin Powell up before the UN holding a vial of anthrax and other biological and chemical weapons, saying that Saddam Hussein in Iraq had these. He did not. And he was put up there thinking that he was being provided accurate intelligence when he was not. And there are people on the inside who have come forward saying that they knew that that intelligence was wrong or very likely wrong. But based on that, we went into Iraq, where we are still embroiled, blew up that whole area of the world. Now we have ISIS. And this was all planned and known with malice aforethought. So we don't have to reach back thousands of years with Trojan horses and machinations of Machiavellian psychopaths who have been militarists in the course of human history. We only need gaze back from Vietnam to today to see the extent to which these false flag operations, hoaxed events, exaggerated threats can stampede a populace and the Congress and the presidency into very dangerous and bad decisions. Now, the mother lode, the sort of the crown jewel of that kind of event is what has been planned assiduously since the 1950s, and that is a threat from outer space that is alien, that would unite the world around a military junta, a militarism, that would put all of humanity together, but against one or more extraterrestrial races. Now that plan, which they came up with in the 1950s, has been very carefully rolled out. And as you know from my friend Carol Rosin, who was Werner von Braun, the man who invented the rocket for Adolf Hitler, the V-2 rocket, and who then was brought in under Operation Paperclip by the OSS into our intelligence community and into our aerospace program after World War II. She said that on his deathbed, he said, look, you know, first they had this plan, there would be the Cold War, when we could have had peace with the Soviet Union. Then there would be nations of concern and global terrorism. This we put out prior to 9/11, by the way. Then they would pull out the big one, and that is the threat from outer space. And it's all a lie. And that's what he kept saying, it's all a lie.
The ultimate dream of the dialectical war machine, the military-industrial complex, is to have this war with a potential extraterrestrial civilization. It's their dream of all times. You know, you can roll into place all the kind of strictures of a national security state. You can spend literally trillions of dollars a year on massive military equipment, super high-tech equipment, et cetera. And so that it's logical that they would use that as an excuse. And we do know from repeated examples of it that the utilization of a false flag operation to initiate a war goes on over and over and over again. Our human family does that. The nation states do that. Hitler has done it. They dress up troops looking like some other neutral country they want to invade and have their own troops dress up like them and pretend they've assaulted somebody, and they rush in and attack that country. You know, it's gone on and on.
Flashback to September 11, 2001. The world is in shock. The American people are paralyzed with fear and grief. Over the next few days, an unprecedented show of solidarity and patriotism. Americans fly their flag from every car and hang them outside their homes. They unify around an overwhelmed president, brought together as one by terror and loss. Few raised an eyebrow as constitutionally protected freedoms disappeared and the war drum beat loud and unopposed. The 9/11 attack set the stage for an invasion agenda that had been pre-planned for years as General Wesley Clark revealed in a 2007 interview.
He said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, this is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran. I said, is it classified? He said, yes, sir. I said, well, don't show it to me.
When Von Braun talked to me about this faked extraterrestrial, he called it a faked alien invasion that was being planned, I saw on a board a list of countries against whom we were going to build space-based weapons. I called Wesley Clark and he answered the phone. And I said, well, what is it about? And he said, well, I asked that question. What is it about? And the guy at the desk said, I don't know.
I said, we're going to war with Iraq. Why? He said, I don't know.
In its paper, published in 2000, Rebuilding America's Defenses, the neoconservative think tank Project for the New American Century asserted that only a, quote, new Pearl Harbor would generate the political will for the military and defense policy transformations the group desired. Indeed, these traumatizing events are always planned or hijacked in order to manipulate perception and manufacture consent for military action and the theft of our wealth and liberty.
George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and others had decided to go to war with Iraq long before Colin Powell gave that presentation. I feel like it was the lowest point in my professional and personal life that I had a hand in managing it.
But we've come a long way since the 9/11 attacks. That same document that called for a new Pearl Harbor goes on to describe how we need to put weapons in space, and even predicts the creation of the Space Force. For a complete fascist takeover, the men behind the curtain will have to play their final card, a cosmic 9/11.
This temptation to generate a false flag attack on the part of some extraterrestrial civilization, you even hear people like Ronald Reagan make reference to it.
Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
Wouldn't it be clear if we all of a sudden found ourselves being attacked by an extraterrestrial civilization? We'd finally all come together. Wouldn't that be really lovely? Well, it's not really lovely for the industrial state. They don't want to lose their other enemies first. They want to use up all that before they go to that extreme.
The last card was the most profound experience I had in my whole life. And I accepted the mission. And until Stephen Greer picked me up and talked me into going to the Disclosure Project, when I had just about given up, that's when I saw that there were other witnesses to what's going on, to the truth, to the facts.
When she told me what Wernher von Braun had said, it didn't surprise me, because I had previously met with a number of people in the defense industry and in the intelligence community who had already told me that there was such a plan and that it could be actuated at any moment. And that was one of the long-term agendas, was keep the technologies away so we can maintain our industrial base of fossil fuel and all this. When we're ready to pull the trigger on releasing this information, spin it in the direction that benefits the foxes guarding the henhouse, the people holding these secrets. But it was interesting to hear that all the way back in the early 70s that he had been warning her about this. And we know that those systems were developed actually in the late 40s and 50s.
Truth.
Here's some examples of her going after the GOP. Liz Cheney calls GOP very sick, questions whether party can recover. Liz knows damn well through Dick Cheney all about continuity of government because her dad set it up, after all. Her dad, Dick Cheney, Darth Vader himself, who, really enjoyed bombing the bejesus out of Iraqi citizens for oil interests, he called Trump the biggest threat to the republic ever, which is kind of weird language, just generally, and also as another Republican. But He was out there, and I started to put the dots together about the COG aspect concerning this, because I said, we know that she knows she's headed for a fall in this primary. So what are they doing with the presidential thing? And it's all the liberal media pushing the presidential part. Here's another thing. Liz Cheney considering presidential run after losing Wyoming GOP primary. See how that doesn't work? You know, like I win, and then I think about getting the presidency, not I lose 30 points, and I think I can make it to president, you know, even though I just lost as a congressperson. Doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, does it? So what is it that they're working on? Cheney's defeat comes with a major silver lining, the media says. Really? What's that silver lining besides the $50 million she has? Well, she started to talk about how we've just begun, and, you know, we're going to be doing all this. And I believe what she's talking about is being a major player when the COG powers are enacted. And this is how I think we can read between the lines here. I'm going to give you a small snippet, biographical snippet, that Dick Cheney wrote when talking about 9/11. And here he says, the U.S. government was functioning. The president was safe. The attack had not succeeded in shutting us down. Speaking of 9/11. Which, as we know, there's so many questions about 9/11, and to take it seriously on face value is ridiculous. You know, the idea somebody in a cave with cell phones directed a bunch of box cutters to take down the United States air defense system, which the Russians and the Chinese and nobody else could have done through all those years, but somehow these guys were able to do it. And this story. And the idea that they probably used remote control planes. That's one aspect that I think is important. But the other aspect that I think is crucial is that you can't fly a plane into the Pentagon. There's a lot of weird things in relation to 9/11, but that one always stands out because you can't get near the Pentagon. They have their own sort of air defenses, and it's just never going to happen. One of the interesting things that happened after this explosion took place there is Donald Rumsfeld, who's the defense secretary, who, you know, during a time when a terrorist attack is occurring, there are rules about a defense secretary. They need to go into this secret structure and plan with the president and all this stuff. And what does he do? He shows up on the lawn of the Pentagon taking someone out in a stretcher for the ultimate photo op, right? Just would never happen. So there are a lot of weird things about 9/11. I have a whole collection around it from my conversations with Jim Marrs and Peter Dale Scott, and it's pretty well identified that they selected the designated culprits, all of Lee Harvey Oswald, beforehand, and within something like 20 minutes, they knew, oh, these are the 19 guys you're looking for. One of the ways that they knew that, which always grabbed me as hilarious and absurd on the face of it, is there's an FBI agent walking down the streets of Manhattan, and he sees this piece of paper sort of tumbling in the air, and it lands on top of a pile of rocks from the rubble from the 9/11 towers. And he goes over and he's like, what is this? And he picks it up, and you know what? It's a passport from one of those darn hijackers. Well, that's good and handy he found that, because that helped them put the pieces together. So that's the official story, that an FBI agent found a passport of one of the terrorists on top of that rubble. So you can see the nature of this is farcical. But it's dangerous, too, because like the Kennedy assassination, it sits out there swinging in the breeze, and the credibility of the whole nation swings with it. But they were able to amass mighty changes, including the September 11th emergency structure that we live under now, from which they can call continuity of government. And we know the continuity of government was enacted by Dick Cheney on September 11th. And that's how you get the Patriot Act and all those wonderful things like the TSA. But anyway, here is our friend, Dick Cheney, as vice president speaking. As we watched television reports in PEOC, it seemed that none of the reporters had been in contact with anyone in the executive branch who could talk authoritatively about what we were doing. Several members of Congress had been on the air, but they were all removed from the business of actually running the country. Someone needed to make a formal statement to the nation, and I knew it couldn't be me. My past government experience, including my participation in Cold War era continuity of government exercises, had prepared me to manage the crisis during those first few hours of 9/11. This is important because he's been identified in many different ways as running the continuity of government program, but that's his only actual admission of being involved with it. So it gives us that background. And indeed, he went off and used the Doomsday Network during 9/11 and then took off into a mountain bunker and came out a month later with the Patriot Act. And that's something. Good old Dick. But his daughter now, you know, she wants to be president after losing in a big thud by 30 points. So what kind of presidency is she talking about, since she's going after Republicans, and the Democrats surely wouldn't accept her with all of her conservative credentials, but they are pushing her, and they're pushing this whole idea. What are they talking about? Well, let's look for the whole kind of crowned COG queen idea. Let's get that COG thing going, the emergency powers. They need people on the top of that structure. And one of the things that we know, you know, I was looking at this, I wanted to get this security classifications down exactly right. So I got the list. And I want to say how this list only makes sense under certain situations. I'm going to explain that. This is the actual succession in the case that they lose the president. And it's the vice president, then it goes to the Speaker of the House, which is Nancy Pelosi, as we know. The President of the Senate, Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Defense, Attorney General, and online down it goes, right down to the Secretary of Homeland Security. Now, however, continuity of government works entirely differently. And I want to really show how the Democrats at the end of the Trump administration were pushing the idea that Nancy Pelosi was going to become president as a result of this when they called continuity of government. That's not the way that it works. In continuity of government, the line of succession goes directly to the NORTHCOM commander, and the NORTHCOM commander is the combatant commander of the United States. He takes over and runs martial law in America. That's the way that it would work. So if they called this emergency, that's what we would get, in fact. Not Nancy Pelosi or even the vice president at this point. So let's go back. I want to prove this up because, you know, I get emails from time to time from people who say, I don't remember them trying to do continuity of government during Trump. And I can appreciate it because actually a lot of it was scrubbed from the internet. And when I went back to find some of it, I was shocked because many of the stories I had bookmarked weren't there anymore. But I had saved a number of them in any case. This is from October 4th, 2020, when Trump announced, I have COVID, right? And they were deciding at this point, can they utilize continuity of government to oust him and do that whole thing? Or should they go with this whole mail-in ballot thing? Secretly, this summer, the White House beefed up planning if Trump got COVID-19. A hospitalized president, a continuity crisis. There it is in October of 2020. Let's go further still. Pelosi, continuity of government in place after Trump tests positive. Here she is. And again, the presumption here that she's working with is she's going to be president. That's not how continuity of government works. The idea being, oh, if Trump and Pence were, you know, both got COVID, then she would take over. No, actually, interestingly enough, the NORTHCOM commander would, General Van Herk. And that still is the case today if they press the button on continuity of government for any reason. And by the way, one of the things that they've included in that and talk about quite often is a cyber attack. Oh, the Russians are cyber attacking us. We need continuity of government. There's a lot of different reasons that they could call it out. And having a weak, senile president in Stepford Biden the way we do now, it's kind of ideal for them to be looking at this. But here's the rest of that article from Pelosi. Reuters, U.S. House of Representatives Speaker Nancy Pelosi said that plans for continuing the government should President Donald Trump become incapacitated remain in place. Pelosi said she'd been tested and would know the tests of her own results and blah, blah, blah. And then in the article, it goes, the Democratic speaker is next in the line of succession after Vice President Mike Pence. And it's very interesting. They're whole ignoring the Northcom takeover guy. Now, in terms of these articles disappearing, I want to show this one because this article disappeared. It was from Yahoo. And it says, an exhausted Trump's long path to coronavirus. Questions of government continuity arose in ways that haven't in years. Trump's diagnosis amounted to the most serious health threat to an American president. And this is the whole article there. Now, what's interesting is you can try in 90 different ways to get the actual article, and you can't. But the leftover is there, that little vestige of what they were trying to do, and the explanation of the article. When you go there, it'll just blow you into wide open random Yahoo-ness. And I've tried a number of different ways to get that original article, but this is what they were pushing. And there was a reason why they were doing this. Now, the continuity of government structure would place us under Northcom, but it would also give us regional governors, and the regions would be taken over by different military officials through Northcom. And they would divvy up resources and things of this nature. Now, I'm not saying this to scare us and to be like a fear porn thing. What I want to do is give us that clear outline of what they're talking about when they get to emergency powers. And I'm going to show where they were going to exercise emergency powers, and they've had dry runs of doing this. And one of those places is Australia, and it's very interesting because those things are breaking right now. Actually, I'm not going to wait another second to get into that section. But before I do, we're going to ask Miss Olivia how it's going out there. How's the temperature?
This is a good question.
Yeah.
Declan Liam McGregor, Daniel, is going to COG, which is obviously more militaristic, set up because of JFK's preference for DIA over the CIA?
No, although Kennedy did beef up the ability because of the tensions that were going on with Russia for us to survive a nuclear war. It's true, although he kept lowering the temperature on that and did actually bend over backwards to kind of keep things with Khrushchev on a workable level. His generals really wanted the confrontational thing going on.
Let's continue with that. S Space Ghost says, COG sounds like military to me, not deep state. And Larry Light says, DJ, how will COG use the military if we get massive defections, bring in outsiders? I'm assuming like UN troops.
This is the interesting thing. Professor Scott makes a good point about this, which is COG in and of itself is just a structure. And that network, the secret network, the Doomsday Network, can be used by good people or bad people. But if it gets in the wrong hands, as it has in the past, we've seen, in Kennedy's case, Winston Lawson was the Secret Service agent who used the Doomsday Communication Network for Dallas for setting up the route that they were on. So he was a clear case of somebody from that Doomsday Network who came in and participated in the deep event of Kennedy's assassination. Also had a lot of sketchy recollections that were completely untrue about the incident of the assassination. When you go to Watergate, you're surrounded by COG people. John Dean, who is Nixon's lawyer, he had just come out of continuity of government, and his girlfriend had also worked in continuity of government. One of the main Watergate burglars had just come out of the COG. So we're seeing these people around these events. Then when you get to 9/11, you've got Rumsfeld and Cheney who set the structure up, restructured it in the 80s, and they're utilizing it and calling COG when you get the September 11th attacks. So, throughout American history, if you look at Iran-Contra or the October surprise, when they told the Iranians, don't return those hostages because we'll give you a better deal, that's all COG Communications Network people involved. So Iran-Contra, they're utilizing, and the Iran-Contra is very little understood, but it's a massive fraud, and it is also diverting directly. So it's giving these missiles to Iran, which is an enemy, and it's saying the proceeds from those missiles, which we're collecting, we're going to give to the people we're supporting in Central America, the Contras, to fight the Nicaraguan government because the Nicaraguan government is being Russian friendly. But Congress had cut off funding for those Contras because of a series of things. One, they were involved in drug running, and two, they were involved in different types of atrocities. and I'm sure the people fighting with them were too. It was just a mess. But nonetheless, like it or not, the Congress had cut off the funding. So to do this, to sell American arms to Iran, which was an enemy, and then take the money and give it in the back channel to a group that we were trying to support in this other country, it was all CIA, Ollie North, Bush, and that whole activity. And a lot of people went to prison as a result. And the whole idea was, did Reagan know about it or did he not? And from my own study of it, he didn't. And the whole operation was run through George Bush. But what's interesting is one of the things about Iran-Contra is it started a big flow of money fraud again. So the question had always become, what did they need all that money for at the time? And it's come up in different lines of research that they were using the UFO threat idea on Reagan because they had shown him some very unusual NASA footage of these ships, and these ships were fueling off the rings of Saturn. And, there's a whole thing about Norm Berglund, and he came out saying, I was the scientist who did this and all the rest. And I think it's absolutely true. Now, the thing is, out of that, Reagan starts talking about what if we had an alien threat, and we find out years later from Mikhail Gorbachev, they sit together and talk at Reykjavik, and Reagan asked him, look, will you help us in the event of an alien attack? This is what he's looking at. And of course, this is a very important figure and point that this is a point I make when it comes to the presidents of America and Russia meeting, which is the CIA. It's their worst nightmare, because if those guys get together and talk about the UFO file, the CIA is cut out of the loop and they can't afford that. So they've freaked out on a number of occasions, JFK with Khrushchev, Reagan with Gorbachev, and particularly Trump with Putin. They don't want those guys getting together and talking the UFO file president to president. They always want these things that are involved. So there's a lot of that involved. If we look at it, the kind of COG corruption that leans over, and then you're like, why are they using that level of corruption? Are they just using it for some criminal enterprise? Well, the things that they're doing are anti-constitutional, like selling missiles to an enemy, for example. But when you get to September 11th, when they use COG, that's their dry run. They're like, let's see how this works. And, here's an actual situation. And on the surface, you say, oh, it's a terrorist attack by these planes. Although anybody logical looking at that, taking the time to go through the 9/11 event, it's just not believable. So whatever it was that was going on, maybe the anticipated attack and simulated one, there's just a lot of unanswered questions about it. Some of the things that I've heard that are convincing is that they had so much in the black budget that they needed to put on budget that they decided this was the big way for them to do that, because otherwise everybody was going to jail. And we know that Rumsfeld was talking about missing money the day before, and we've had Catherine Austin Fitz's study on this. So we're well educated on that front of things. But the question is, this deep state structure, which is committing these different acts, and the deep events that they're committing always seem to involve the COG people. So it seems like the deep state and the COG thing is a lock. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take that deep state research, and now I'm going to introduce the UFO file aspect as we look at it, because COG is becoming very relevant when we look at the fact that Cheney's daughter is the one that they're touting as a president when she has absolutely no support, either Republican or Democrat. What's going on there? After we get through this Morrison thing, I'm going to give you something special on that. But let's do the Morrison thing, because I think it's significant in demonstrating how COG works and may answer that last question. All right. So Scott Morrison was extremely unpopular during the lockdowns because of the fascist abilities that he exercised there in Australia. And they had tremendous problems with him, kind of worse, I think, than any other country. If you think even of like France and other places like that, they had their problems. But Morrison had just some of the most jackbooted lockdown policies that were beyond bizarre. But that was a real tryout for this New World Order structure. Okay, but something happened. So he lost the election because of his unpopular policies, but he still remained a member of parliament. Well, interestingly enough, recently some things came out about what he was doing as prime minister, and watch how the emergency powers operate, because it's very instructional. Secret powers of an Australian prime minister now revealed. This is New York Times. Even they have to turn this guy in. Scott Morrison was busy during the pandemic. In addition to being prime minister, he covertly put himself in charge, covertly, remember, that's in secret, put himself in charge of 5 ministries. That's like saying, I'm defense secretary, I'm treasury secretary, I'm housing secretary, I'm secretary of state and president too, but I'm not telling you. Critics say he damaged democracy. Okay. Let's go with this a little bit. Australian slam former leader for secretly taking 5, count them 5, cabinet jobs. So this is the consolidation of all those jobs into one person. So therefore, if I make a move and I say, well, I have this new COVID policy and I'm calling martial law, basically, there's nobody in the cabinet to disagree because I have all the jobs. And that's exactly how it worked. This is the guy going off to have a cabinet meeting. I kid you not. He's having a cabinet meeting with himself. So he's taking his meeting notes there, and he's like, I can't wait to be there to greet myself.
It's like a Monty Python sketch.
It really is. Scott Morrison, Australian ex-PM, resists pressure to step down because he's still in Parliament. He's still a member. Former Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison has resisted calls to resign from Parliament after news emerged that he'd secretly assumed 5 additional roles during his tenure. And again, he did it in secret, so nobody knew. That's our friend Morrison. That's why Australia got so screwed up. Scott Morrison's ministerial grab holds lessons beyond Australia. You bet your life it does. These people can just do this in the background, sign a secret note covertly, and suddenly, voila, I have 5 different positions. Can you imagine Stepford Biden being like, I'm defense secretary? All right. Here's a little bit from that article on Morrison. That's not my job was uttered so often by Scott Morrison in his final months as Australia's prime minister that the phrase became a running joke. As it turns out, he had far more jobs than voters, Parliament, or indeed some of his own cabinet, realized. While in power, Morrison quietly appointed himself to 5 other ministries during the pandemic, in some cases without the knowledge of the relevant ministers. In other words, I'm just doing this. It's got no oversight. Nobody else knows about it. I'm just assuming those jobs. This is how the emergency powers work, because if they were moving to consolidate and take that martial law step, it was up in the air. They were deciding on it, but they needed those positions consolidated. And then he could step forward and do it. There'd be no opposition because he was doing all the jobs. The revelations this week have ignited a firestorm, raising questions of accountability, transparency, and the concentration of power. They are questions not just for Morrison, but also for Australia and other democracies around the world. The pandemic provided the perfect fig leaf for strongmen in more authoritarian systems to amass power. And they go after the Hungary guy because he threw George Soros out. But what we have there is a very clear-cut case. Okay, now let's jump to Canada. In Canada, they did the same thing. They called the emergency powers against the truckers during the trucker protests. And remember, he's operating with under 30% popularity. But interestingly enough, he created a new cabinet position because she was the finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, who used to cozy up to all the Russian oligarchs in the 90s and the early 2000s. And she was a journalist, actually. And here she shows up as this kind of totalitarian dictator along with Trudeau. Very odd indeed, except she's been working on George Soros's biography and working directly with Soros for a decade. So it explains a lot there. But here's what's interesting that they did. They created a new position, and the position was Deputy Prime Minister. So here we have them again, sort of, giving her 2 jobs, just like Morrison is picking up jobs. And the idea is, if I have enough phony positions, I can consolidate this thing. Now, it's interesting because I'm going to show where Trump also realized that this was happening and tried to amass a version of shattering that system and also figuring out how he could advance his own programs through very shady means as well. But it's very interesting the way that he was doing it, because again, and this is part of the intense hatred on behalf of the establishment for Trump, which is he knows the keys to the deep state because of his association with Roy Cohn, who basically was one of the big architects of the deep state. And so, you know, some people say, well, that says a lot about Trump. Well, it shows an interesting thing about Trump, whether you know, regardless of your stance on him. It shows that he knows. So if you think he's a good guy and he knows, I guess that's good. If you think he's a bad guy and he knows, that's not so good. But he knows. He knows about the UFO file and through his uncle, and he knows about the X technology through his uncle and the Tesla transfer there, which we did an episode on last week. And you know, we got some great feedback on that episode, because I think people are really starting to get some of the work that we've been putting out there around this. And I would tell you, I couldn't believe the date on the Tesla Trump and the time capsule, which contains a lot of that information. That's from 2018.
Amazing.
It shows you the thread of how this unwinds. And, you know, I've talked about that in relation to Nixon. And this is very interesting about Nixon as well, because people didn't realize that relationship between Nixon and Trump. So therefore, a lot of the things that we were talking about early in the X series went over people's heads, because it, you know, it was like, well, you know, how do you know that Trump had this relationship with Nixon? By the time the Nixon Library released those records in September of 2020, then everybody knew. But, you know, that's the thing, which is you need that information, you need it early, and you need that insight. But that relationship was very clear for a long time. And there's deeper aspects, because as we talked about on the previous program, there's Nixon's UFO letter, the time capsule, and the Robert Merritt story hanging out there and becoming all the more strange and strangely relevant after the FBI raid. So now that story rings heavy. And I said I took this story as far as I could, you know, and Merritt, the whistleblower on that, who was a member of the Houston plan, who claimed he'd met with Nixon, and Nixon wanted to keep this UFO letter as a time capsule for when disclosure came out, and had him deliver a copy to Henry Kissinger, and said he was going to hide one in the White House. All that's very, very interesting, and we took it to where it would naturally go. But the idea of Reagan and Nixon and some of these presidents being deeply involved with disclosure makes a lot of sense, because a lot of them were behind UFO documentaries. They had whole programs for getting this information out. So each president, when they get in there, they think, I might be the one, you know, and I might be the one who goes on the record with this. One of the sleazier things that I saw was during the Obama administration, he actually shut down a lot of UFO research and didn't advance the space program. It's a weird presidency. In fact, it's kind of the clerk for the bankers presidency, and let's take over Libya and bomb 10 countries in the Middle East presidency. Obama's a real interesting twist, and that might be a person who wanted to do something differently. And but nonetheless, the record of that presidency is bizarre in how aggressive it is on a militaristic basis, and also how, you know, keeping those financial people who had caused the 2008 financial crash, so, you know, just supporting them. And it's a very, Obama's presidency, it needs to be looked at very deeply, because it promises one thing and becomes just such a weird charade. But what's interesting about him is that as soon as they started talking the UAP stuff, you know, and during that came out through all the things that they're doing in the media about this, trying to make UAP, this whole thing, as a replacement for the UFO file, because it's a CIA press directive. It's a press push. It's a PR move. You know, it's where Lou Elizondo comes from, Chris Mellon, all that stuff, the TTSA, those are all CIA structures on the record. It's very important to understand their promo moves. And that's really where it was at. But what's interesting, if you look at the Obama presidency, is he came out and started talking about, last year, oh yeah, there are UFOs, there is all this stuff, and he starts getting on board after really shooting the topic down for 8 years as president. So there's something very disingenuous about him suddenly jumping on board. Speaking of disingenuous, I've got a pair of disingenuous guys I want to point out here. And this one really gets me because Ronald Moultrie, who's a Department of Defense guy who came before Congress during those UFO hearings and sat there with a congressman scoping out plans and ideas for how they could punish amateur interest groups who were studying UFOs. This is what they were talking about. How can we punish them? That's a really good question, Congressman. Maybe we can get together in secret session and talk about that. No, maybe you won't, because that's not constitutional. Ronald Moultrie, NASA Administrator Bill Nelson, and I are looking forward to our teams collaborating on an unidentified phenomenon. We greatly appreciate all that our NASA colleagues are doing in the areas of science and exploration, right? And that's Bill Nelson, the senator from Florida and former astronaut. Very interesting, odd program they announced there at NASA. I'll get into that in a minute. But here's Darren LaHood, who was sitting there and specking this out with our friend Moultrie about how we can punish people basically for picking up a UFO book. It's very strange. And the idea being that basically the government version of this should be the only version. Well, when I went into LaHood's past, it was quite fascinating because LaHood had spent many, many years as the U.S. attorney in Las Vegas. That gave him dominion over Area 51 and a number of those secret programs. So this guy is coming from a place of UFO secrecy immediately. He's an Illinois congressman now. And I would say he's one to watch. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, going deep, deep tonight on the continuity of government program, UFO file. So many great friends with us here tonight in the Ideas Room. And you bet I'm going to shout you out at the end of the show. But Miss Olivia, before I get into stage 4, DEF CON 2, what do you got? And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the Ideas Room already. And tonight we're going to do a special report here. We're going to go in for about an hour on some of the really hardcore things that the Biden regime is pushing along the lines of surveillance and censorship. And we're going to do it through that new Disinformation Governance Board, the new Ministry of Untruth, as it were, that they're trying to rifle through while everyone's confused with all of this Roe v. Wade stuff that's in the air. And are they repealing that and so forth? One of the kind of fascinating things that we see going on as well is, a lot of firsts. Like this is the first time the Supreme Court has ever leaked a decision in advance, for example. So we're in some very kind of strange territory as we get into all these things. And, you can always say that, oh, well, this issue is worth going after, that one's worth going after. But the idea is to compound your attention deficit by overloading you and then rifle things through in the background. And this is what we're going to get into tonight. This is a special report, and it's all about the deep state moves in the background and their Ministry of Untruth that they're trying to bring forward. And right in the middle of that, believe it or not, is the UFO file and the work of the Central Intelligence Agency to consolidate power for international finance groups that are controlling the United States and other democracies around the world. So we're getting into that tonight. And, this is the kind of report, a lot of this stuff just couldn't wait with everything going on. But also, I find it amazing because even though when we do the X series on Fridays, there's so many things that I leave behind because there's just a need for, this incredible updates on a regular basis. So here we are. A couple of things I wanted to get across right away is that there's a bill floating around out there, which is meant to reinforce this whole thing around the Disinformation Governance Board. And we're going to get into that bill and why it needs to be stopped in Congress and why they keep pulling the bill. And it's very hard to get news around this bill because they're trying to do it sort of in the darkness of night. I wouldn't be surprised if they caused a number of kind of radical reactions to this whole Roe v. Wade
overturning idea, and then in the background they pass this thing through some kind of mega session and then launch the domestic terrorism force. So, you know, this is how they have us kind of like a hamster on a wheel with all these stories. First you're in the COVID op, then you're into the Ukraine emergency. Soon they'll have a nuclear emergency. They've been very open about talking about that. Of course, the UFO threat op, there's a whole congressional piece that went through today, and I'm going to get into that as well. Open sessions in the Senate Intelligence Committee, the threat, you know, the UAP threat, and Lou Elizondo giving commentary to disgraced writers at Politico and The Hill. And it's interesting because one of the things I wanted to note is that one of those writers, Brian Bender, in fact, was one of the guys who gave me a hard time for pointing out all the inconsistencies around the To the Stars Academy, which he helped to launch by being the supportive measure, the supportive factor going on in the background for them. And it was quite interesting because what happened with that whole thing was wild, because as we got into the entire mess around the lies that TTSA sold the public when they came out around the UFO file, and, you know, the CIA launched this company. It was in fact Bender who backed them up, and then the New York Times was able to run that story and so on. Now, this very same Bender writer is saying, well, you know, maybe we should have asked more questions, and, you know, that was a shady outfit after all, and, you know, all their answers are inconsistent. So it's funny, you know, they don't go around 3 years later and come back to us and say, you know, hey, you're right on this. They just kind of, you know, scurry off in the background when the op goes south. That's the nature of Central Intelligence work, and we need to keep that in mind. And that's why when we call these things out and we get that big pushback, like, what's the big problem with having CIA people in the UFO file? That's the problem, is they're masters of disinformation, and they leave a lot of carnage and reputations on the carpet. And I'll tell you, a lot of the reputations of people who were researching in the UFO file have been damaged really badly, and rightfully so, because they were clinging on to this whole promise of, you know, entertainment documentaries and TV shows and all the rest, and they let the CIA basically prop up a phony media company. So we have to keep that in mind, that it's not worth it. And you know, there's always that Benedict Arnold factor as well, which is, what exactly are you doing by cooperating with groups like the Central Intelligence Agency, whose very purpose is to undermine any kind of rule of law, and who in fact act as an extra constitutional agency, and, you know, are fundamentally, you know, a beacon of disinformation, just as they collaborate with the Department of Homeland Security and Stepford Biden on creating antidotes to disinformation. That's why they're the Ministry of Untruth, not the Ministry of Truth. But of course, we were warned about all this so many years ago by Orwell, and hey, guess what? It turned out he was exactly right. Isn't that fascinating? How did he know? I want to say that we're not going to be taking questions tonight. We don't have the lovely Olivia, but we will have her coming up on the next X show, and we'll take your questions then. We do have Kat out there doing a great job in the ideas room, and I see a lot of great people out there tonight. And the ideas room is vibrant as ever with the questions. So we'll definitely be getting into that next week. I wanted to, a couple of things that have been going on in the background I wanted to point out, as these other stories have been so distracting, you know, the Met Gala and Elon Musk and Twitter and all these things. These are very interesting stories for sure. And they do get into the back and forth that's going on. And yet, I feel like they are deep cover as well for a lot of these other things that are happening. For example, this story just hit. CDC tracked millions of phones to see if Americans followed COVID lockdown orders. Totally illegal action. Newly released documents showed the CDC planned to use phone location data to monitor schools and churches, and wanted to use the data for many non-COVID-19 purposes too. In other words, we have the cover of the COVID op, we get all the data, and then we use it for something else to track you for other purposes. For example, to put you on a domestic terrorism hit list. So that story is being widely covered now in the media. There's just no way of getting around it. Right on its heels, the FBI conducted millions of warrantless searches of Americans' data in 2021. So the CDC, one government agency overreach. Number two, the FBI. There's another one. So what's going on here? These are all illegal, unconstitutional searches of our information, and yet no heads are rolling. Nobody's being arrested. There's no cases for it. There's not even a hearing about this. This is pretty major action. And now we have to wonder, and here's where we're going to get into it, what is it exactly that they're looking for in this data? I think a lot of it comes down to who is going to give them a problem, because what we're seeing across the board with the deep state takeover of these different countries is they're using people who have very low popularity. Just look at Stepford Biden, for example. He's 29% in the polls that favor him. Okay, those are Democratic polls. And Justin Trudeau, you know, somewhere around 22%. These people with those types of majorities can't really rule. They can't govern. It's impossible if you have 20% of the vote to be able to do that. So they're going to need to rely on emergency powers, and they get most of that through the continuity of government action of September 11th. The September 11th action for emergency, which we're still under that emergency, as hard as that is to believe, we're still cooked completely in that exact same situation, even though we've gotten Republican presidents through their Democratic presidents. You've had Obama. Everyone said, hey, Obama's going to get rid of that for sure. No, he doubled down on it. And every year when they signed the NDAA, which is the National Defense Authorization Act, boom, there we get all that money again, $800 billion. As long as you have that emergency signature attached, you're going to get that money. And that's the way it goes, whether it's Trump, Obama, or Bush, or Stepford Biden. So they're all on board with that. And you have to ask why? Well, because when government gets that kind of ruling authority, they don't like to give it up. So now all of these bills for domestic terrorism that we're seeing that are being pushed so heavily by the government and the Biden administration are all coming out of the Department of Homeland Security. Well, the Department of Homeland Security went from 10,000 employees to 250,000 today. That's 250,000 people. Think about it. First of all, that's an extra constitutional agency as well, right off the bat. And not to mention the fact that the Department of Homeland Security, their original designation was to prevent terrorists from entering the country and protect the homeland. And a lot of the idea was to change America from the United States to the homeland and then assign it a different constitution and use a number of different types of techniques, legal techniques, to accomplish this. So we're finding ourselves right in the middle of that maelstrom. And here we are 20 years or so after the September 11th attacks, and these guys are ready. All the same rules that they rolled out to prosecute extreme Muslims, Muslim terrorists and extremists, and all the unconstitutional warrantless wiretapping and all that are now they're trying to codify those into law as they distract us with this hysterical stuff on the side. The question is, are we going to go for that, or are we going to call it out? And one of the ways we can call it out is by going after two central essential bills. And on top of that, those are domestic surveillance bills, and I'm going to get into them right now. And then on top of that, the UFO threat aspect, which is what's coming on in the layer on top, and not a lot of people are talking about that one. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Special Report. It's great to be here with you all. I'm not in the studio tonight. I'm just broadcasting from home, and I wanted to make sure that we had this opportunity just to have a special report. I want to remind everyone to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for a newsletter. That's the thing that keeps us in touch, regardless of all the incredible censorship that we've been watching, hands down across the board. This is hardcore. And we're seeing people getting thrown left and right off these platforms, and we have been for a while. And, you know, it is funny when Elon Musk went in there and said, I'm going to buy Twitter, everyone was like, all right, that means changes. And they all start tweeting him, hey, can I get my account back? And like, thank God you're restoring democracy. And that's funny, too, because he doesn't even have the company yet. You know, I mean, he's getting there, but it takes a while. And we have to be very careful about that type of attitude that somebody on that upper level is going to do it. I'm all up for if we can get cooperation on higher levels, but though all those things are controlled, especially when you get to space, you have some of the most controlled people, period. And so Elon's whole kind of romp here and like the phony fight with the left and all that, that can be dismissed pretty quickly as just wanting to get market share back. because, Getter and Truth Social and some of those other ones, they're becoming the ones that are gobbling up this audience, because the conservative audience, Christians, for example, conservatives, libertarians, that's huge and far outweighs the liberal members of the audience. But the liberal members of the audience, and you can't even say liberal anymore, because liberal, for example, John F. Kennedy was a liberal in his day, but he would call all these liberals fascists for the things that they do in trying to take away others' rights. So we have to kind of keep our heads wrapped around this. But in any case, the liberal control over the mouthpiece of social media, the press, and all that, which comes directly out of that World Economic Forum control grid. The deep state has decided they can use the liberals, and they worked in them for a long time, and they took certain aspects of their intellect and they tricked them into thinking that they were smarter than the other groups that are in the country. And when you think you're smart, you're in trouble. We've seen this over and over again. And so they're looking down on these other, the deplorables and all the rest. Oh, what do they know about anything? We don't need that Constitution. Actually, those guys should all be, put in gigantic camps, and we'll just run things. And this is the kind of MSNBC attitude, and it's been frightening. I mean, we've seen actual leaders like Justin Trudeau saying, let's make sure we don't tolerate those with views, for medical freedom or whatever it is. And how much hypocrisy can the country of Canada take before that, they just throw that guy out? It's hard to say. It's hard to say, but they don't, even when they pulled the whole emergency powers action, when the truckers were taking over and really giving it to them, that shows really that this is how they run things. They can't get by without the emergency powers. In fact, their popularity is so limited, there's no ability to govern. And that's what we're looking at. So let's look at some of the bills that they're using to thwart the system of democracy. And of course, we've heard a lot about the disinformation czar, and she is quite a panic. I'm going to try not to focus on her so much, but boy, what a character. So Homeland Security itself, this is how they're portraying this. Let's start with this. Department of Homeland Security Internal Working Group protects free speech and other fundamental rights when addressing disinformation that threatens the security of the United States. I'm surprised they didn't say Homeland. They don't like to say United States. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security is charged with safeguarding the United States. Hold on. That's the military's job under the Constitution, provide for the common defense. It's not really. The Department of Homeland Security, is extra constitutional in this sense. But anyway, against threats to its security, including threats exacerbated by disinformation. What they call disinformation is anything that's against the regime. And this is the nature of the problem. And there's a certain regime in there that, needs this kind of cover. And they've thrown out a lot of loyalists and taken on a lot of people during this 2 decades of power. And now the people that are embedded in there, a lot of them are Obama people, in fact, and they're all loyal to Stepford Biden for now, while his cognitive decline, doesn't completely take him out. So we're looking there at what they're trying to introduce with the Department of Homeland Security with this new Disinformation Governance Board. And they're claiming that it's related, believe it or not, in here they say, well, Hurricane Sandy, for example, that would have been affected by disinformation. They're trying to make these connections where there are none. So if they don't like, for example, the way that I talk about the UFO file and the phony CIA threat around the UFOs, then that's disinformation, and it's dangerous. It's just as dangerous as, Ukraine-Russia war propaganda. So in fact, the country is based and, has it ensconced in the Constitution, free speech. It's right there. It's the First Amendment. It's the number one most important thing. So the founders understood and discovered, and they realized that without free speech, you don't get anywhere. That's how the king locked people down. So by creating this system, they created this great leveling where the average person would have the ability to influence the government and could tell his fellow citizens what was going on. Now, what we're looking at, they need to get rid of that mechanism. And we've seen them squelch stories that were important, of course, in the last election, the Hunter Biden laptop story. Now that's come out. and this has been, absolutely crucial data, was left on the cutting room floor because Twitter and Facebook blocked it. And so we got into a real crisis there of the Constitution. That was a real red line when they prevented the New York Post from publishing the story on these platforms. We didn't take the message then, and now we're stuck with this situation. And now it is kind of a fight on a level that, can be very dramatic, because these people are desperate. I believe that in their psychosis, they thought with the COVID op and the Ukraine war, they just, take over. And I think that's what's in the back of their minds. But the problem is that all of them have sworn an oath to the Constitution. And every aspect of government, from judges to presidents to senators to Congress people, swear an oath to that Constitution. So they have to change the meaning of free speech in these documents. That's what they're going to try to do. Let's look at some of the articles covering this, because even the people that are on their side are shocked and dismayed at the arrogance of the push to just take away the ability for free speech so openly. This one, Biden establishes a ministry of truth. This is out of the Wall Street Journal. The Disinformation Governance Board already looks like a partisan instrument. Yeah, it's a lot worse than that, but that's a good start. Department of Homeland Security has announced the formation of the Disinformation Governance Board, charged, according to Politico, with countering misinformation related to Homeland Security. See how this is how we can bring in Homeland Security. 250,000 people doing illegal actions, doing surveillance on average citizens, moms who are complaining to teachers that they don't want their kids taught certain things. They're showing up on domestic terrorist lists. This is how far these people are going. And if they're not stopped, they're going to get down to basic levels, like, having people in the grocery store spy on you. Believe it or not, there's a plan for that. I mean, as absurd as it sounds, it's true. Department of Homeland Security has announced the formation of the Disinformation Governance Board, charged, according to Politico, with countering misinformation related to Homeland Security, focused specifically on irregular migration and Russia. These are weird tricks. They need, in order to pull in the Department of Homeland Security, they need immigration to somehow be related to it. The next piece they need is, Russia disinformation. That way they can say, we're protecting the homeland by shutting you, the average American citizen, up when you disagree with the policy of the Biden regime. All right, next up. In a twist too implausible for fiction, the abbreviation is DGB, one letter off from KGB. Excellent point. The stated goal of combating mis and disinformation is framed to seem unobjectionable. Who objects to truth and pines for falsehood? The DGB experts will guide the way, separating the informational wheat from the disinformational chaff, but there's one small problem with empowering truth experts. Experts are people. Yeah, and in this case, fascist people. People respond to incentives, therefore experts respond to incentives. And so on they go in here. There's a couple of really good points in here. The dangers of the DGB will be amplified if it becomes a tool of partisan political actors, and it already has. Executive Director Nina Jankowicz, who, is showing up as the bimbo of the century. But, I think in a way they want that, in a strange way, because then she can be the face of it. Musical theater, scary Poppins, and all these kinds of things. And it's true. She is a bizarre individual, but the thing in her background that fascinates me the most is that she was an aide and an advisor to the Ukrainian government. Everywhere we go around major moves right now, we're seeing the Ukraine involved. What is the meaning of that? And how ensconced was the Biden political family with Ukraine, that every major move seems to be their power base is coming out of Ukraine? That is very disturbing, as is the loose nuclear talk and the lack of a peace process from this government. They're not interested in a peace process, and that's a really big problem. Every single time you get into war situations, there's a massive peace process involved. And, look at the Palestinian war. And, we've paid governments off before. Let's think of Egypt. Okay, we'll give you $5 billion. Just stop getting into it with Israel, okay? So Jimmy Carter goes over there, everybody shakes hands, and that's that. And we continue to just dole out money to both sides. All right, for some reason, bankrolling that situation for peace, that's one way to spend your money. This is a little bit different. But there's always a peace process involved. The Palestinian-Israeli thing, as long as that's gone on, there's still a process. With this war, they have incentives to keep it going, and they want the emergency powers won. They want to weaken Russia. This is their new policy through Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. So these are all very disturbing factors just lingering in the background as we're doing this. And then you're looking here at the disinformation czar, and you're looking at this new office, which is supposed to crack down on dissent in the United States, and you wonder to yourself, what's going on with this? These are the same people who created this idea, that the extremists and the Al-Qaeda, will put them on Gitmo and all that kind of thing. But now the citizens of the United States are supposed to be stripped of those rights. And so that we can be kind of put in our own little personal Gitmos and the digital concentration camp and things of this nature. So now the domestic terror bill takes its aim, kind of directly from taking its cue from the 9/11 domestic terror acts. And, so now they're changing the Arab terrorist extremist into the citizen of the United States. Now a United States citizen, boom, forget it. You are Al-Qaeda. And, so that gives them the ability to do all these illegal searches that I referred to earlier. This is really those people that were engaged in those searches have to be prosecuted. The Senate Intelligence Committee needs to stop all the work that they're doing, including the phony UAP threat briefings and all that, and say, who are those people that were facilitating those types of illegal searches of United States citizens? And that's what needs to be prosecuted and move forward. And then when you do that, you're going to reveal the house of cards that's trying to push this domestic terror bill. So it's actually a race between, can people get the knowledge in time around who's been going into their private data from the CDC and from the FBI? And can we prosecute those people before the domestic terrorism thing gets thrown into law, because you have the Democrats running it, and the Democrats have gone completely insane. Now, I like to be independent on this program from Democrat or Republican. And, there's a lot of room in between, but those parties are dominated by warlike factions. But the DNC is just becoming so close to the CCP and has such an influence of China that I consider them an enemy of the United States at this point. I couldn't resist the Scary Poppins shot of Nina Jankowicz, but there she is. I know that in some ways, this doesn't really go to individuals, and I'm not going to make it a habit just to hang around and to make fun of Nina Jankowicz, because it's going to be too easy. But I do want to say that when you get this 33-year-old person who's been working with the Ukrainian government and who says that there is no deep state, that's ridiculous. Look, get to work, do some homework, Nina. Study the work of Professor Peter Dale Scott. By the way, he's a left coast liberal, so it's not exactly like you're talking about a conservative here. He's the one who invented the term for deep state. Okay, so for sure, there's a deep state. Where are you getting that? And the kind of brainwashing inside that Biden administration is beyond absurd. But also, let's face it, that administration is going down. It's one of the most incompetent of all time. Some of the worst players I've ever seen. Secretary of State Blinken, who oversaw the disastrous route running out of Afghanistan and the Russian route of the Ukrainians rolling in. So these are people who were political hacks and political insiders and wanted to get into the feeding trough of all this money circulating, but they don't have the chops to deal with the real foreign policy of the United States. And it's getting to be a very dangerous situation with the likes of Lloyd Austin, for example, who's more interested in what religion that his soldiers practice than protecting the country. And frankly, it's none of his business if a soldier has a particular, Christian identification or identifies with a different religion. It's just none of his business at all. And we need to keep that in mind. But yeah, a disinformation czar, terrible idea. And the idea that we have this like weird musical theater flunky who has visions of fascism and sucking up to this fascist administration, it's a pretty bad scene. So we need to smash the Disinformation Governance Board. Every congressman, every senator needs that letter. And let me tell you, in Washington, there's one thing I know: they all read their mail. So send that letter and just tell them, you're out. But it's already starting to collapse because this is an interesting thing too, because as the Biden administration is going down in the polls, they're doing more and more things to pull the attention into different places. You notice that they reinstated the press dinner, and they went up there into this kind of terrible routine of hanging out there and ignoring and making jokes about the inflation and people getting thrown out of their homes. I mean, this is the most tone-deaf organization and administration I've ever witnessed in my lifetime. I've been following politics at least a couple of decades here. So, this is really a serious situation, and we're in some pretty bad hands. And the best way that I think we can, stop them in their tracks, basically, is to get the word around. They're trying to slip in this domestic terror bill in the background. Let's go to the domestic terror bill. Now, there was a guy out there, senator from Tennessee, and one of the points that he made was really fascinating. Quote, "Disinformation board may be illegal and require a vote of Congress," senator tells Department of Homeland Security. Yeah. That's the Congress. That's actually the Constitution, okay? The Biden administration's new Disinformation Governance Board, the DGB, may be illegal and subject to a vote in Congress, a Republican senator is warning Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. In a letter to Mayorkas Monday, Senator Bill Hagerty outlined a legal critique that could set in motion the board's undoing. It should smash that board. We need to get rid of that board immediately. As the White House sought to tamp down public concern about Big Brother-like panel and its controversial head, who has her own past of spreading disinformation. Exactly. Nina, the joke, Scary Poppins, she's also been guilty of pushing misinformation, including saying, hey, all the Russian disinformation of the laptop, the Hunter Biden laptop, has been confirmed by 51 intelligence officials, including all of these CIA directors. Well, they were really hardcore to do that because they wanted to do anything to get President Trump out. And that whole piece is a huge scandal because all of those 51 CIA officials are still on record saying that the Hunter Biden laptop was disinformation. But even the New York Times and the Washington Post is like, well, no, really, it was the real thing, So those people never came back and apologized. And there's no accountability. This is the problem. In society now, it's just like people say crazy stuff and that's it. They retreat, pay them off, bring John Brennan in here, here's $1 million, just say some nonsense BS about this and put it on the record. And we'll quote you. And then when you prove to be wrong, there's no process inside that media for saying, hey, this guy lied in public, shouldn't be trusted again. And we don't want to see him show up on MSNBC or wherever else. Somebody like that can get a show. Not that anybody even watches MSNBC, except the brainwashed people around here in Cambridge do. It's unfortunate. It's very unfortunate. Hagerty wrote that the board may violate the Anti-Deficiency Act, which says the executive branch can't spend money unless Congress authorizes it, and that its creation also may be subject to the Congressional Review Act. Absolutely. He nailed it. This thing's illegal. No congressperson should vote in favor of it. If they do, then, pretty much every congressman and senator should know that their neck is on the line for the vote in November 2022, and that they're going to go down. They're going to lose votes as a result of that. And then maybe they'll look at this and they'll say, Stepford Biden is in the 20s in the polls anyway. Why should I get behind this ridiculous Big Brother thing? The DGB, this Disinformation Governance Board, likened by Republicans and also some left-wing and libertarian critics, I want to point that out. The Glenn Greenwalds and the Matt Taibbis, they know that this thing is BS too. So this is not a right-left issue. This is free speech versus a psychotic Orwellian organ that's going to walk around and, make sure that Facebook gives all that information, all of the things that you've been posting. I'm sure they already are. The board would be led by Nina Jankowicz, a disinformation expert. How exactly do you get to be a disinformation expert? Who repeatedly cast doubt on the Post reporting on documents from Hunter Biden's laptop. She was clearly wrong. Washington Post and the New York Times belatedly have verified the Post story about the Hunter Biden laptop. She has also come under fire for her own postings on social media, including a TikTok in which she jokes about free speech and fake news in a parody of the Mary Poppins classic, Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. So she's really, you know, this is somebody in way over her head, right? She's a 33-year-old, and, you know, she could be somebody that with the right background, if she understood that there's a deep state and all this other stuff, sure. But instead, she's just a bubblehead, somebody that they grabbed out of musical theater school and, you know, somehow got her on this track. And now the Biden administration is using this kind of, you know, bimbo factor, and they go in there. And so they've got, you know, and Blinken's a bimbo too, don't get me wrong. And Lloyd Austin is a bimbo. This is just, the entire administration is just a complete, you know, it's one of the worst administrations I've seen. And you try to look down the line to find who's holding the line in this administration. You can't find anybody. It's certainly not Jen Psaki. I think that she's been running the organization of the administration for a long time, but even she's going to jump ship, because how long can you stand up there and just lie to defend this ridiculous administration? And, you know, you look to the vice presidents, you look to the transportation secretary, Buttigieg. I mean, come on. This is some of the worst characters that we've ever seen in government. So, but this board would be really a bridge too far. It would take us really into the dark ages, and we have to really make sure that this doesn't happen. Quote, establishment of this board will significantly impact Americans' free speech and rights and cuts across numerous areas of government and society, Hagerty wrote to Mayorkas. Hagerty gets it. Hagerty has it on spot. And the Department of Homeland Security head, the Mayorkas, this guy is just, you know, he's got 250,000 troops out there. This guy is getting delusions of grandeur. He wants more and more power, more and more control, more and more of a seat at the table at Davos. So these are the types of people that need to be cut off by the fact that there's no public support and that the public is calling them out. And when the politicians see their polls going down over this, they're going to jump ship on it. And Stepford Biden is going to be sitting there with his 20% approval, and he's going to be sitting there with his weird delusions over Orwellian grandeur, and he's not going to be able to pull it off. This is a crucial factor. It will also substantially increase administrative costs for the number of different federal agencies engaged in this effort, which will impose increased costs on American taxpayers. Look, you've got housing costs that have risen 24%, which are putting people in the street. We've just sent $33 billion more to Ukraine, which, let's face it, is not a country where we have a strategic interest, and probably is a country where, by trying to force NATO in there, we provoked a reaction from Russia. And I don't approve of the actions of Russia in Ukraine, and I think they should get out, and there should be a deal on the table for them to get out. But at the same time, you know, even the Pope, all right, this Pope, who we know has really been in the tank for the New World Order, he knows also that this is going on too long and there needs to be a peace process. Look at this. Pope says NATO may have caused Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Even this Pope is catching on to that. Okay, so this is just, you know, that end of the war is a disgrace, as is making Zelensky a hero. You know, Zelensky is just an actor. This guy's worth $500 million. I mean, this is insane. And, you know, they just threw him into office. We knew also that in 2014, the CIA went in there, and the Central Intelligence Agency, what is it that they're good at? They're good at causing coups. They did it here in 1963. Remember John F. Kennedy? I'm going to get to something new that came out about President Kennedy, but he was taken out of office by the Central Intelligence Agency. It's 60 years later. This is still what these guys are good at. So, and they're also great at getting us into trouble. Let's not forget weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Well, where did that really come from? George Tenet. And what did he say? Oh, that intelligence is a slam dunk. Well, did we ever find any weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? No. So we sent all those people in there. We spent all that money, all those American lives, over 4,000 soldiers, American soldiers died in that war, untold Iraqi civilians. For what? Because the CIA had a relationship with the oil companies. This is the nature of the government aspect, why we need to understand the deep state and go in deeper. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Special Report. Great crowd, unbelievable crowd here for a Tuesday night. And there's so many things in this report that I'm glad we have the opportunity to do this. And I want to remind you while we're here to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for a newsletter. That keeps us in touch, and it's a free newsletter, and it allows us to have that update, back and forth, and feedback loop back and forth with you guys, just in case the social media companies, which have shown that incredible fascist censorship tactic, if these guys get, in mind, if it starts to boil down to, oh, the Ukraine thing's failing, the COVID thing is failing, and all the rest, then they're going to get rid of any dissident voices. We've seen all kinds of things about the social media companies deplatforming people, Consortium News, their payment processor took them out. That was something that was founded by Robert Perry and a lot of the people who questioned 9/11. And this gets us into some of the fundamental rules about dark journalism that I've pointed out over and over again. One of them is that, you have the official story. In the case of 9/11, these hijackers got on a plane with box cutters and took down an air defense system that had been set up to avoid nuclear war. Okay, that's the United States air defense system had been set up during the Cold War. That means you couldn't thwart it with some hijackers. It wasn't going to happen. So, but the official story is that some guy in a cave controlled these people to do that. All right. And took down the biggest military in the entire world. So, and we know, in fact, there's so many inconsistencies 20 years later around that story. It just doesn't hold up at all, the official story. The secondary story, a lot of professors, including Professor Peter Dale Scott, a lot of writers, researchers, credible people went into it and said, here's a lot of the things that actually happened, including a lot of weird stock movements in the background while all this was going on relating to airlines and Homeland Security style equipment, because they created Homeland Security directly out of the 9/11 attacks. And it's relevant now to speak of 9/11 because Homeland Security is the ogre in the room that just keeps growing and growing. It's like Jabba the Hutt. And it's got 250,000 employees. It's getting fatter and fatter. Now it wants the disinformation board. This thing just, they want to basically control the United States through the idea of protection, and that you'll be safe. We will protect you. So over and over again, we need to step back and take a look and say, well, how did we get into this? What is it exactly that took place here? And Department of Homeland Security is a good place to start. Fundamentally, conversations like the one that we're having here is what they're trying to stop, and we have to remember that and keep that in mind. So yeah, definitely the newsletter helps because it creates that flow without worrying, oh, is this company going to shut me off? Is this platform going to be here? And people are always amazed. They're like, wow, it's amazing we can still find you. Well, look, my way of looking at it is I'm going to keep doing what I do. And the platforms, I think fundamentally, they eventually are going to have to wake up to the fact that people, especially Americans founded, on free speech. And, other countries follow our lead on that. But Americans in particular have a thing about it because it's in the Constitution. It's how the revolution started, in fact. So when you get down to that really core point and you're looking at it and you say, look, free speech is fundamental. What is it these social media companies have tried to do? Twitter tried to deplatform everybody who was talking about, alternative medicine and who were talking about alternative political scenarios and all the rest. Get rid of this person, get rid of that person. Facebook does the same thing. Plus, they take all your data and they give it to the FBI and they give it to the CDC illegally. Those are illegal actions. Eventually, there's going to be some kind of class action lawsuit. So we're already seeing a lot of the stories that they've been laying out there. So it's a kind of a race. The idea is, can they get their system in place with a very small portion of the public? Again, I know that people think, oh my God, everybody's gone crazy and all the rest. Actually, I believe that the numbers around 25% of support for this administration, reflect more of what's going on there. Just like the Justin Trudeau 22%. These are very small controlling numbers. And what they're trying to do is get a system in place so that they can't be touchable. And the way that you do that, as we've laid out so much on this program, is the continuity of government rules, especially in America. But the continuity of government rules can go global, as we've seen. They've talked about instituting continuity of government in Ukraine and in Canada. So they like this idea. And fundamentally, just to reflect quickly on COG, look, COG was put in place to create a gigantic underground establishment of a government in the event of a nuclear war in the 1950s. Now, when we take that infrastructure over time, what happens is it gets out of the way of responsible leadership under the presidential umbrella, and it gets into clandestine hands. And the way that it shows up is that every time there's a deep event, which is something that Professor Scott has pointed out, whether it was Watergate or Iran-Contra or 9/11 or even the coup of 2008, people associated with continuity of government always show up in the middle of it. That goes all the way back to the Kennedy administration. So that group has its representatives. And for a long time, you couldn't even say the word COG in Congress. And then sometime around 2020, during the COVID thing, they started to love this. And Nancy Pelosi was talking about it every day. I had a quote here, which was from 2020, because somebody had mentioned to me, because I said Nancy Pelosi was talking about COG being in place. And they said, where did you hear that? So I have about 14 different sources. I'm going to show one tonight. This news articles, Nancy Pelosi says continuity of government in place after Trump tests positive. This story, I'm telling you, this is what took place there in October of 2020, is that they wanted, when Trump supposedly got COVID, they wanted that to be continuity of government takeover. They weren't sure that the election chaos idea was going to work. They wanted this other thing. And they had installed this other figure, General Van Herk, who they felt was a better make. And what's interesting is the defense secretary at the time, Mark Esper, he was somebody that Trump fired after the election. This is a very unusual thing. Why would you fire a defense secretary after an election? Well, this guy was involved with that plot to organize and activate continuity of government. And that continuity of government was supposed to put Van Herk in charge of Northcom in case they just could not pull off the other things to remove Trump. And you remember, even when they said, oh, well, Trump lost the election, we're doing this recount and all this other stuff. When that was happening, you had figures like Brennan and all the rest coming out and saying, you know what? In fact, we should call the 25th Amendment on this guy because we have to get him out. He might do something dangerous between, here and January 20th when he's supposed to leave. And that was interesting because General Milley, in a quite anti-constitutional fashion, he called up China and he was like, don't worry, we'll prevent Trump from doing any bad things, so don't you worry about it, okay? I mean, what kind of a general does that? It's something weird going on at that level of the Pentagon. You may have recently seen the Pentagon spokesman crying over Ukraine. Look, there's lots to cry about over Ukraine, but as the Pentagon spokesman, I don't think that's a good image to reflect out to the world of a teary-eyed, leader of the press conference. And, we're looking at a situation where this government looks like they've been co-opted. And I think we're getting closer and closer to seeing those factors. And there's no question that the DGB, this Disinformation Governance Board, these people don't want to be called out. They want to get rid of independent media. They want to get rid of this conversation, in fact, and that's a fact. One of the interesting things about that as well is all the things that I mentioned about Consortium News and Mint Press News and all these other groups. And now they're going after payment processors. Remember, they did this with WikiLeaks. That's how they got WikiLeaks in trouble in the first place. And then about 3 or 4 years later, they took him and physically put him in prison. But the first thing was shut off the money. Well, no wonder we don't really trust digital money. And no wonder the Solari group is so interested in Cash Fridays, because when you or I lay that $100 down, it's worth $100. But if you're a political dissident, you have digital money, you're out. And if they don't want you to buy pizza, you're not going to buy pizza. So those are the political realities while we're under the Stepford Biden regime. We can get rid of this regime ultimately. And certainly I do think, although a lot of people are saying, look, elections don't matter and, you know, all the rest of it. I understand that. And I understand the cynicism around it too. Don't get me wrong. However, I do think that a change in leadership into 2022 would be huge. And that's what we need to shoot for. Okay, more. Now we're going to go into the UFO threat aspect of this. And let me tell you, if you think the news has been weird on the Supreme Court side, wait till we get into the Senate intelligence briefing on UFOs. I already mentioned that Brian Bender, who was the one at Politico who facilitated the TTSA story through the New York Times by confirming it, by checking in with a corrupt official at the Pentagon who had been thrown out of the Pentagon afterwards for being bribery. Okay. That's the way that string went. That's the backstory behind the New York Times UAP Lou Elizondo TTSA story. It's CIA placing corrupt officials and using journalists, you know, and saying, here, I'm giving you this big lead. And then those journalists saying, well, you know, you sure I can trust this? And they're like, we're the CIA. And also when we do the TV shows, guess what? You're going to get a big part. And so they did that with a lot of those journalists that supported that original story. That story had so many holes in it about, you know, this disgruntled guy named Lou Elizondo, and he's come out of the Pentagon. And even though he's a former CIA guy, you can still trust him. And, you know, he's going to give the word on UFOs. That whole thing in the Pentagon story, which came out December 16th, 2017 about UFOs. And the New York Times finally said, aha, you know, we're going to go forward with this, was because they had something in place for a UFO threat operation. And that operation was supposed to be pulled off under Hillary Clinton, President Hillary Clinton, believe it or not. What a terrible ring that has to it. They weren't able to pull it off. That's the thing. So now we have Hillary's understudy, Kirsten Gillibrand, the senator from New York, whose family is very close with British Aerospace One, BAE, and then the Nexium cult as well. Keith Raniere, who went to jail for 40 years in prison for his, you know, bizarre sex cult and all the abuse of all the people that they pulled in. And they pulled in a lot of Hollywood people and politicians and all the rest. So a lot of questions around Gillibrand and her ability to be blackmailed. Her partner in this is a Republican, Rubio, who we also know at times there are a lot of weird stories that come up about him. So in fact, what you're looking at are maybe two of the most blackmailable senators on the Senate Intelligence Committee. And that's a problem. That's a real problem. Okay, let's take it from here. UFO briefings on Capitol Hill have begun. Lawmakers aren't impressed. Okay, that's the story today from Politico. And it is, in fact, Bender, who, again, he was the one who initially confirmed the New York Times story. That's how that whole thing got rolling. And remember, it was only, as I started the show off, it was only 2 days ago that Bender said, you know, we probably should have asked more questions. And TTSA, yeah, we should have asked him more questions. And, you know, it turned out a lot of things they said were misleading. Oh, gee, wow. A lot of people who pointed it out at the time got a lot of flack for doing that. So I guess guys like Bender now should go back and apologize. Okay, lawmakers receiving the latest secret briefings on UFOs say national security agencies still aren't taking seriously the reports of highly advanced aircraft of unknown origin violating protected airspace. Now, look, they take UFOs seriously. They just don't want to talk to the public about them. That's the position of the government. They're behind a wall of secrecy. They've been working with this stuff for years. They certainly take it seriously. The idea that, oh, there's this group and they're freedom fighters, they want everybody to take things seriously for UFOs, is to rally a group of people that they've measured out there. Because in 2018, the top search on Google was UFOs. And they figured out we can utilize that demographic. How do we do it? Because only a few years before that, they were looking at the situation and they were saying, oh, no, there are no UFOs. In fact, the CIA made that stuff. and they were putting out their own press releases. That's one of the first tweets by the CIA was that we did it. We were the ones who did it. We're the ones who made UFOs. And then it all changed. Then the whole track changed, and we got this thing. And we have a really weird group. Originally, it was the UAP task force, and the idea was, oh, there's a terrible threat. We need money to combat the aliens. And that didn't fly so well. And their report basically went over badly. Then you've had Lou Elizondo, who comes out of this op, and he's been floundering around. He's had some, he has a book deal now, and he's had shows and stuff like that, but he's been floundering around. He's been making a lot of mistakes. And so I think now they're trying to think, can we do this more official thing with Gillibrand and Rubio and really pull this UFO threat aspect? And a lot of this was being pushed during the COVID piece. So let's remember that too. While you were locked down in your house, you were supposed to be fed this steady diet. And they wanted to get the marketing data on what was going on with these people. What were they thinking? Are we in trouble on this UFO thing? Can we actually scare people with the UFO threat idea? This is kind of important. Members of the Senate Intelligence Committee and Armed Services Committees received classified progress reports in recent weeks on a series of new data collection efforts the Pentagon and spy agencies are now required to pursue to more rigorously investigate reports of UFOs. 3 people with direct knowledge confirmed. Yeah, I mean, whoever you're talking to, they're the same people who said TTSA was legit. So come on. It's not exactly like you have any credibility left, Mr. Bender. One of those lawmakers is Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, a member of both committees who's called the phenomena an urgent issue. Why is it an urgent issue? Do you have some background, Senator Gillibrand, in UFOs? Is it because your husband's dad was in British aerospace intelligence? Does he know something? Is that why? Like, what makes it urgent? Exactly. I mean, we on the ground know that all of these UFO cases have been going on for years. It's you guys that have ignored it. But what is it that is making you guys UFO experts? What makes Senator Rubio a UFO expert? What makes the UFO threat so attractive to these people? This is what I want to get at, and it's really it's becoming very important to figure out what is it that they're getting out of it. Why are suddenly these yo-yos who are in the Senate and Congress fascinated by UFOs when they never said anything about it until a year or two ago? What's up with that? Senator Gillibrand believes that the DOD needs to take this issue much more seriously to get in motion, said one of her aides. They've had ample time to implement these important provisions. And so, it goes around in this big circle. A couple of things that are interesting in this article, though, is there's a movement away from this TTSA version of the threat, and they're trying to move into a Senate Intelligence Committee version of the threat. So I think that the Bobo aspect of like the Tom DeLonge and the way that intelligence uses these people, they're ready to cut strings on that. They're still looking at Elizondo and thinking, oh, this guy, he's making a lot of mistakes. Maybe we don't need him either. The office, which is supposed to, they created 2 offices for this. And one of them, which is the most ridiculous name in the world, the ASRO is the Anomaly Surveillance and Resolution Office. Okay, that's just basically a way of saying, look, we'll have a way to say to the public that we are keeping up with your concerns. But then in the middle of that, they came up with AOI MSG. And, it's like this weird thing whenever you try to get into the UFO file. Look, the UFO file is the biggest secret of the US government. There's no question about it. And it's because of the X technology that's involved. They've been keeping that secret for over 75 years. And the Central Intelligence Agency, in fact, was born in post-war conditions, largely around the idea that we can contain this information and keep it secret, as well as dealing with international finance. That's where the Central Intelligence Agency's main protocols came up, because originally when the UFO file aspects hit, a lot of the government people didn't know anything about it, but there were groups that understood about it because they'd been tracking this stuff. There was a major crash actually in Missouri in 1941, and Harry Truman was the senator that oversaw that entire case. So they knew it was up long before our friend Kenneth Arnold came in and said, I saw these crafts, which, by the way, look more like boomerangs. They don't look like saucers, but somehow that saucer thing stuck. And that's the way it goes. Arnold's sighting was legit, and what he was watching were these advanced craft. And some people can say, look, you know, the advanced craft aspect, we might be looking at this, you know, it could be off-world, sure. But let's face it, we have the X technology in-house as well. And so we have the ability to put forward these things and make them, you know, seem like they're otherworldly. So you're always dealing, when you're dealing around these things, is it ours or is it theirs? And for sure, I think that we can confirm there's off-world aspects to this, but there's so much X technology that we possess that a lot of these craft could in fact be things that we're making. But let's go a little bit further with this, because this just came out today, and it's all about the Senate Intelligence Committee briefing on UFOs. The office, which is supposed to be fully operational by June, was granted the authority to pursue any resource, capability, asset, or process to investigate unidentified aerial phenomena. Some of that language is strange too. Really? Any resource? Any capability? Is that part of that surveillance that they've been going there, the illegal FBI surveillance we cited earlier? The Pentagon office is supposed to be developing an intelligence collection and analysis plan to gain as much knowledge as possible. And, you know, they have their traditional thing. Oh, we're looking for this, and we hope to be sharing some exciting facts with the public and all the rest. In fact, what we're seeing is they've been trying to build a UFO threat. They've been trying to build a funding corridor for that UFO threat. But for some reason, with the failure of the COVID op and with the Ukraine situation, positioning that UFO threat has become difficult. That and the fact that the people they had relied on, like the To the Stars Academy people, Jim Semivan, and all the CIA people were supposed to carry this across the front line, you know, across the goal line. And what happened was, instead, DeLong and Elizondo, a lot of people really started to look at them and say, you know, these people aren't playing with a full deck. And so that part of the op has stumbled a lot. So they're fractioning off the op in a few different directions. However, the UFO threat op is extremely dangerous because they have the technology to fake an alien threat. And I don't think that there is any threat from off-world visitors. You can't say that in the world of galaxies there aren't any threats out there, but we haven't seen any threat from the craft that we've been observing, I'll put it to you that way. And so this idea of overlaying it with an extreme threat aspect, or with this idea that, hey, you know, these saviors are coming in to save our environment, which is the Avi Loeb trip. You know, Avi Loeb's little physicist lab is like 5 minutes from here. And this guy has been putting forward, he's a member of the Israeli version of the CIA, okay? And so he's always been working under that intelligence window. But his fundamental idea, and he's been given a lot of credence, is that things like Oumuamua that have floated into our solar system are alien craft being piloted by AI. And that we need to get our own AI up to snuff so we can communicate with that. And you can just imagine how that would go. You know, the probe would say, you're destroying your environment. You need to tax everybody with a carbon tax. And I'm all for cleaning up the environment. I've put this across over and over again. But the idea that this is something, you know, that the corporations aren't responsible for. Look, they're the ones who made the incredible profits from it, you know. And there's a whole ridiculous thing around Tesla and SpaceX as well, and all the things, the incredible destruction to the environment from those companies. And then you've got Amazon and all the rest of it saying, we need to like fix the environment. You know, you guys destroyed it to become billionaires and you've sold it to us that way. So I think we should call out the thing about the environment. I think over and over again, we see on the alternative side, whenever we get around the environment, or, you know, climate change and all the ops that they've put in, but we get away from the idea that some of this stuff is real for sure. I mean, look, they've done nuclear testing in the atmosphere. Has that not damaged the atmosphere? Yeah, but who was responsible for those tests? And the corporations that have sold and made these mass profits and all the rest of it, and they went to China, you know, because they could get away with all these regulations being thrown out the window and getting slave labor. I mean, who's responsible for this destruction and who has the money to pay for it? It's real obvious. Those corporations have that. I mean, Apple has $40 billion on their balance sheet sitting there, not doing anything. It's not reinvested. And, you know, you think about that, and you think about the massive impact that these companies have had on an environmental level. Those are the people who should be paying for it. I'll tell you what, 10% tax on all of those super corporations, especially the tech ones, Facebook, Apple, and all the rest. They've made the environmental problem, get them to pay. Then I guarantee you they'll shut up about it really quick. And the idea of a carbon tax will disappear very quickly. By the way, so many breakthrough energies have been available that a lot of this discussion is absurd, because they've just been creating this environmental problem by hugging that whole oil economy. And that's just not an economy. You know, look, if you really go back into it, and if you look at Tesla's grasp and what he said, he could beam wireless energy the way you can beam wireless communications, we wouldn't have any of these problems. So it's them wanting to maintain this hegemony and that dominant position in society. That's been the major problem. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist special report. We've been going deep on Biden's DGB, and this is the Disinformation Governance Board. It sounds a lot like the KGB, doesn't it? They're trying to rifle this through with their low approval ratings, and just hoping that through emergency powers and domestic terrorist bills and all the rest of it, they can get enough power to accomplish the aim of locking down society. And in the background there is a big push saying, you know, even on the inside of that establishment, they're like, I'm not so sure this communist part is going to work anymore. Let's go out there with Musk and drum some different thing up. You know, let's create this idea that there's somebody really interested in free speech, and, you know, get people to latch onto that and somehow figure that aspect out. I think there's a real, honest to goodness, genuine split in there. And I do believe that all those groups believe in that kind of dominance aspect, but I feel that they have different ways of accomplishing it. And I think that the COVID group has embarrassed them. And the Fauci types has embarrassed the upper establishment. I also think that they're ready to cut some of those people. And so either they retire, or, you know, they could kind of be in line for some kind of an accident happening. You know, just, it's one of those things. Wouldn't it be unfortunate if you or your family would have some kind of an accident, Mr. Fauci? So that's New York language. I'm sure he understands that. All right. A couple of interesting things on the domestic terror bill, and I want to identify this bill and how we can help oppose it. House Judiciary Committee Republicans vote against important domestic terror legislation. Yeah, it's important to Chairman Gerald Nadler, okay? And a lot of these guys are deep in the soup. They need to get this domestic terrorism thing across. With a chance to confront the rise in domestic terrorism, Republicans talk tough but act soft. And then they go into a whole bunch of BS around the J6 thing. But what's interesting about this is Chairman Nadler says Republicans have once again showed their true colors when it comes to domestic terrorism. Look, I think that the Republicans generally, just the fundamentals in the background, their actual voter demographics believe in the Constitution. This is the nature of what Republicans are about. And so I think that even if it's a cynical move on the part of some of these Republicans, they're much more inclined to go with what the Constitution is about. And that's a huge split, you know, from this group, the DNC group, which has been taken over by this Chinese communist influence. They want to get rid of that and put in the social credit system. That's the new constitution for them. And that's the kind of control wave they think they can do here. Trying to do China in the United States it doesn't fly. You might make it fly in certain cities, and certainly they've created a lot of problems, but you know, they're not going to be able to make that fly in the country at large, because the country is fundamentally set on the Constitution. It's been bent, it's been broken. There's been so many rules that have been, you know, and laws that have been disobeyed. But fundamentally, this is a constitutional republic. So therefore, trying to roll in these domestic terror bills, which are completely unconstitutional, if they're found out and exposed, then those people who swear an oath to uphold the Constitution are they're in a problem. They're in a quagmire. And that's what we need to be able to push that across. And Nadler, for sure, is somebody who's deep on that. Let's see. I had one other thing about this bill. Hang on just a second. You're watching the Dark Journalist Special Report, everybody. It's a great crowd out there tonight. And we have Kat running the ideas room, doing a great job. We'll go about 5 more minutes here. All right, I'm going to get briefly into a couple of very interesting things that came up around President Kennedy. Now, there's somebody out there, a very interesting lawyer, who is actually suing the National Archives now. This is an interesting thing. JFK assassination records lawyer sues National Archives working on a complaint against President Biden. Watch how this rolls. A lawyer has filed a lawsuit against National Archives in an attempt to obtain the underlying correspondence and memos relating to the decisions of Presidents Donald Trump and Joe Biden to postpone the release of the JFK records 6 decades after the event. Obviously, there is something in those records after all. Judge Napolitano confirmed in his conversations with President Trump, who he was friendly with at the time, that there's something very explosive in those records, oddly enough. The one spearheading this attempt to gain information about the national security threats that these records allegedly pose is attorney Larry Schnapp, who has been interested in the assassination since he was a child. Schnapp told the Epoch Times that in February, the government singled out 5,700 pages relevant to his request and will be sending them to him in 250-page batches. Now, he is actually moving this, going around the official process somehow and getting this. And what's interesting is it is RFK Jr. that's backing him up in the background, which I find extra interesting because, of course, RFK Jr. knows full well that the Central Intelligence Agency was behind not only his uncle's murder, but his dad's. Schnapp told the Epoch Times he received part of the first group of documents last week. Some of it's redacted, and he plans to challenge that illegally. Quote, the files released in the first tranche pertain to President Trump's October 2017 decision to postpone disclosure on the assassination records for 6 months. These documents show that the National Archives disagreed with postponement requests of the CIA and FBI and how the rationale for the temporary 6-month postponement was orchestrated. RFK Jr., nephew of Democrat President John F. Kennedy, is in favor of the efforts by Schnapp and said, I support the suit. It's a 60-year-old crime. There's no excuse for not complying with the law and releasing the records. In addition to this lawsuit, I submitted the attached letter to the archivist on behalf of a team of lawyers I've assembled requesting that the archives follow up on a number of search requests tendered to the Central Intelligence Agency and the FBI by the Assassination Record Review Board in 1998 that remain outstanding. They were required by law to give those records up in 1998. They didn't. 2017 was their last deadline, and they got it kicked up to 2021. And Stepford Biden said, 2025. How does that sound? So these guys they'll never let those records out. What's interesting, however, is that they still are holding on to such a passion to keep those records out of the mainstream. And you have to ask after 60 years, why? And you might also say, look, there's not going to be any smoking gun in those documents. However, it is unusual that President Trump, in talking in private with Judge Napolitano, which just got revealed in December, in which we reported on this program, that he said, look, Andrew, if you saw what was in those files, you couldn't release it either. So where does that take us? It couldn't be, hey, the CIA assassinated President Kennedy. Pretty much everyone knows that. So it has to be something else. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Special Report. We're getting deep here, and we went into the Disinformation Governance Board and the Domestic Terror Bill, which they keep keeping behind the scenes, and they keep rolling that vote because every time the vote comes up, strange questions get asked about it, like, what are you guys doing? And then it disappears, and the press doesn't report on it, and then whoosh, it shows back up. But there were a lot of unusual stories around JFK this week that came out. I'm going to get into a couple of them. One is that the Chicago Secret Service agent, Abraham Bolden, the first black Secret Service agent on a presidential detail, pardoned by Biden nearly 60 years after conviction. This is big news. And I spoken with Bolden online before, and I haven't had him on the program for an interview, but he pointed out he was the first black Secret Service agent, and he was involved. He wasn't on the detail that went into Dallas, but he had worked with those guys in Chicago, and he had called out a number of unusual things, and also had suggested that there were deeper aspects involved in the assassination. They couldn't have that, and they set him up on a phony bribery charge, which he eventually got cleared of, but it never got expunged off his record. So he wasn't in prison all this time or anything like that. He led a full life, but he'd been put into prison, and his whole life had been destroyed, basically, by those forces inside the Secret Service. And he'd been on Kennedy's personal detail. You know, Kennedy had talked with him and others about potentially being ambassadors to Africa and things like that. And Bolden had said that Kennedy was keenly aware that there was an assassination threat, and that the person that was helping them in Chicago, and this is what they've left out of a lot of the news stories about this, but that it was an informant named Lee in Chicago that helped them thwart the assassination attempt only a few weeks before President Kennedy was killed in Dallas. That is very unusual, because we think about Lee Oswald and this double role that he was playing. That very well could have been him, but there he is, Abraham Bolden, and congratulations to you, sir. That was a group of pardons that out of 73 showed up under President Biden. And it's truly remarkable to see that happen under any circumstances. Here's another weird story that came out around this too, though. Actually, there's so many weird ones, I'm never going to get out of here. Okay. FBI released report on Pelosi's father, originally ordered by JFK. Are you with me on this? FBI released report on Pelosi's father, originally ordered by JFK. Remember, we've got corrupt Stepford Biden, and of course, mafia princess Nancy Pelosi. But way back there in 63, her father was doing this quasi role between the mafia and the government, and he actually had a position in government. While the attention of the entire planet was directed to the storming of the Capitol on J6, the FBI quietly released to the public a report which had been ordered by historical President John F. Kennedy into Thomas D. Alessandro Jr., father of current-day Speaker of the House of the U.S. House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi. It's unclear what exactly prompted the FBI to release this report at this time. There's no question that they put it out there in the whirl that, you know, it wouldn't get any press attention, and that was kind of the good time to do it. The report carried a few interesting revelations. For decades, rumors had existed that D'Alessandro Jr. was entwined with Italian mafia activity. It was only confirmed the fact in 2018 in the Federalist Papers. That report by the Federalist Papers referred to an FBI report made into Mr. D'Alessandro Jr., requested and presented to President John F. Kennedy. But they didn't make the report available until J6. Some of the before unknown revelations brought to light, though, were that Pelosi's brother, Franklin D'Alessandro, was charged with rape of 2 underage girls. Franklin D'Alessandro was among 12 young men tried for this crime. However, notably, he was the only one of the 12. He was the only one of the 12. These charges were dropped in 1953. One additional revelation revealed in the report was apparently Thomas D'Alessandro Jr., in addition to alleged mob ties, was known to have been involved with several communist groups in the 1940s. It's really, this is a big story. And they have a shot there of Alessandro with a very young Nancy Pelosi. But wow, you know, we're getting into some seriously deep territory. And there's a reason why Kennedy ordered the FBI to look into this. Think about that. And so this kind of, mob control on the part of Pelosi, her family, and all the rest, that's been going on for a heck of a long time. One other weird JFK piece. This is very strange, and I'm going to investigate this one deeper, but just watch some of the moves on this. And this one actually Kat Goida sent to me. Thank you, Kat. Kennedy anniversary update, settlement over loss of JFK photo archive in 9/11. The estate of President John F. Kennedy's personal photographer, Jacques Lowe, has accepted an undisclosed sum from J.P. Morgan Chase Bank over the loss of 40,000 negatives in 9/11. Jacques Lowe's treasured archive has been stored in a safe deposit box housed within the vaults of 5 World Trade Center, a building next to the Twin Towers destroyed in the terrorist attacks of New York City. The pictures represented almost all of the photographer's Kennedy images, and most had never been published, many capturing historic moments of President John F. Kennedy at work and at play. So this archive was kept then in this building, and for years, it was rumored that the archive still existed, and so somehow J.P. Morgan had access to the archive. And this was the estate suing them to get it back. And finally, J.P. Morgan was like, all right, we're tired of it after 2 decades. Here's your money. But, I can't help but think with this guy's 40,000 pictures and the fact that the building wasn't directly struck by this, that it was kind of one of those after effects. It's very strange that this got eliminated, this whole 40,000 Kennedy negatives that were in the vaults of this New York bank. He could have never foreseen the tragedy, this photographer, more from the article. He could have never foreseen the tragedy that would strike his treasured collection 11 years later. For the location of the deposit box just down the road from the photographer's office was number 5 World Trade Center, a building adjacent to the Twin Towers, which were destroyed. I wonder a lot about that vault of photos and what there may have been in there. I want to point this out too. When the Boston Marathon bombings occurred, and this happened live, and I was a witness to it. What I'm about to say is that the Kennedy Library went on fire, and there was an explosion there, and a lot of news. This happened at exactly the same time, and all these news crews went over there. Channel 4 in particular did an interesting interview, and they went in there and said, "Look, what happened here? It's a huge explosion. Did you figure it out?" And this woman comes out who was like, one of the directors, and she said, "Nothing's going on here. Everything's fine. Like it was just, a little in-house fire. It was nothing." And the guy pans the camera over, and there's this huge plume of black smoke going there, over UMass. And so it was very strange. Shortly after that, we got the Carlyle Group taking over the Kennedy Library. And it's interesting because, it had been said that the Kennedy Library tapes that Jackie Kennedy had left, which were supposed to be revealed 75 years after the assassination or after both of her children were deceased. And so there was a lot said about the possession of those tapes and what were on those tapes and what Jackie knew about all this and had put there as a kind of insurance policy that, like, if you try any more of this, what's going to happen. So this thing that's gone on behind the scenes, this clandestine war between these forces that want a more open America and these fascist forces that have come in through NASA, and through that kind of paperclip influence on intelligence sources, the whole Galen setting up of these intelligence networks, that post-war Nazi thing that Dr. Farrell talks about so much, it seems to be playing out, even after all this time, that war that goes on in the background. And for sure, this DGB, the Disinformation Governance Board, is a way again to silence dissent and make sure that these people never get found out. And believe it or not, that fight, that struggle goes that far back. And with that, I will leave everyone. I'll do a couple of shout outs before I go. And thank you so much for being with me.
Exactly. Actually, I was just going to ask you, what is the tactic they'll use to hang on at any price?
Invisible weaponry. They'll use mind control. They'll use weather warfare. They'll use arson. They'll use covert operations. They'll use war by every possible method, mostly covert and invisible.
Mm-hmm. False alien invasion. They'd do it. They would do it.
I'm not saying they wouldn't do it. I just don't see how you could be effective at doing it,
Yeah. Interesting. Catherine, I want to go back to war for a moment, because you framed this so well in terms of what we're in the middle of right now.
We remember a couple of years ago I told you, don't worry about collapse, worry about war.
Yes.
Remember? I told you. Yeah.
Absolutely. We've had this kind of invisible war where you can't exactly see who the enemy is. You've talked about that as well, and being able to identify who that enemy is. So in that whole, where are we now with this? What is it we're looking at in terms of this enemy?
So for some reason, the leadership is absolutely convinced that they need to destroy Russia and bring Russia to heel. And maybe that's because that's the only way they can bring China to heel. We'll see. Okay. But because Russia is the land bridge, it crosses 11 time zones.
Wow.
Right. Well, it goes all the way from the tip of, goes all the way, right next to Japan, all the way across into Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So from the Pacific down to St. Petersburg and into Europe. So it is the land bridge. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And as a rising Asia meets the world's largest consumer market, it's dangerous to the Anglo-American alliance if they get cut out. It's the chessboard.
Right.
So I don't know, they are dead set. If you look at what's happening in the Ukraine, I don't know if you saw this latest headline about drones, but if they're going to send drones to Ukraine, the only way those drones can operate was with American satellites. And then you're talking about an active war.
Yeah.
If you send a drone into Russian airspace that does something negative, that's the U.S. That's an active war by the U.S. if it's U.S. satellites, even if you say you gave the drones to Ukraine.
It's so crazy.
No, it's not crazy. They're trying to start a war. They want a war.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the problem is, I don't see how you win a war.
Right.
But maybe they don't want to win the war. I don't know.
Do you know that, you maybe saw this, but Kissinger himself at 98 came out and said, you can't have a full-on war with Russia. It's too risky for the United States. Take a portion of the Ukraine and cede it to Russia. So even that old guard, which was not really, which built the deep state, even they are looking at these guys and saying, whoa, what are you doing?
Richard Haas in 2004 wrote a fabulous piece in Foreign Affairs magazine where he basically, in a very, I would say overly gracious way, said that the neocons were going to get us killed and they should back off.
But I think it's compelling. I actually think that his comments, Putin's, on the world stage are less bellicose. And they're more like, do you get, he's kind of saying, do you get the message, I think, very often. And he's trying to get that word out. And he says, to Europe, I'm not against you, Europe. I'm against your leaders, etc. Now, this is a tricky thing because, I think that Putin's action in Ukraine is deplorable as well. So, but I think that they were forcing him into a situation by putting NATO on his doorstep and through, and Ukraine acting very hostile. So we've had this back and forth going on, and there's been a war over Ukraine for quite a while. But, we have to look at the situation ourselves globally and say, who are the people that are trying to put us in a digital concentration camp? I mean, who are they? And, we equate very often people in the World Economic Forum in relation to this. So, that's much more important than any one particular country, one particular enemy, like Russia. And Russia could easily be, and were for a number of years, an ally, a competitive ally, basically. And, we've partnered up with them all the way back to World War II and beyond. And then we had this massive kind of Cold War expanse that went on for decades, even though incredible presidents like Kennedy and Reagan try to unplug this process. So there's an element inside of both countries that likes and benefits from this. And it's a global situation. And that's why things like Lockheed Martin and like Boeing and like that circus that they create to get these war sales going has to be exposed further and further. We saw it all. If you go back to Nazi Germany and the war that we had going on there's all the trading with the enemy activity where, the companies over here were giving them the nuts and bolts to make their tanks to roll across Europe. I mean, we have to be real about this stuff. So it has to be called out in terms of where it's coming from. I think that's the most important thing. And so, we're not happy with Putin and the things that he's doing, but what are we doing on our side? Have we created a general peace process to say, you know what, even Kissinger of all people said Ukraine's going to have to cede some of that territory, and they're going to have to create a peace process. Well, that's even the old deep state corrupt guard. So what is it that's on top that even opposes that? We have to wonder just what kind of a freak show that we're involved with. And are they looking to get us all, into some sort of nuclear situation? So it needs to be looked at and really stopped now. With anything, I'm going to get into a couple of quick things right at the beginning relating to Russia. And Russia comes up later in relation to the mystery aspect of all this. But I want to just bring them up because, they've been taking these very hard positions against us, and we've been provoking them with the whole Ukraine situation and $80 billion that America doesn't have and all these weapons and things. And who's really making out here? Well, it's Boeing and all the defense contractors and Lockheed Martin with the Biden administration in that aspect of the deep state. It's really a psychotic situation that they've tripped into. And now, they have a psychopath running Ukraine, Zelensky, who was an actor and a comedian that they brought in to do this. And they wanted to get someone who they could, be relatable. So the United States populace would support this guy. But a lot of people see through him, especially with the past that he has. But this is interesting because one of the things that they're trying to do, and part of the reason of the provocation of the whole war, was to make Ukraine a NATO state. Of course, the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance Organization, which is something that we developed during World War II to make sure that these nations stayed together and would fight, in the event that any of the NATO partners were attacked. We've kept adding different countries to this. And the problem is that, the security guarantees by the United States are just dramatic overreach in relation to this and too much dependence on us. And it's one of the things that the Trump administration pointed out well, which is none of those countries are paying the United States to do this. And they're way behind in the amount of money. The Trump administration collected $500 billion in delinquent dollars from Germany and a number of the other EU countries. And you have to wonder, is this part of the reason for the savaging of the Trump administration? So this is very interesting to me because we're in a strange situation there where they're trying to provoke us into being into World War III with Russia, which is a crazy idea because one, Russia's a nuclear armed nation. Two, they pose zilch threat to the United States. And so engaging with them on this level, there should be a dramatic international peace process. There's nothing like that anywhere. Instead, we get this whole violence thing going on. So we've seen a lot of support and ridiculous amounts of money, and every other day, the Biden administration is slipping a few more billions to their friends over there in Ukraine. And unfortunately, the people on the ground, both the Ukrainian citizens and the Russians, they're the ones who are taking the brunt of this, while these larger groups just sit on top. But anyway, Zelensky today says Ukraine will pursue fast-track application to join NATO. Now, if they're in NATO, then that means we have to defend them, which means if they're at war with Russia, that's World War III. So this guy is not thinking about the interests of the United States. He just wants, he's just playing his role for the World Economic Forum and other groups, the IMF and the deep state, really pushing this aspect of World War III with a nuclear-armed Russia, which is beyond absurd. Russia, for their part, they've made a lot of heavy moves, and a lot of this couldn't be well advised, in my opinion. And I would highly recommend that they go to the peace tables and call this off too. But what's happening is he now is annexing these regions, and they did have a vote there, and the vote was, hey, we want to join. But so this process is getting pretty wild. And then we have this situation where after Putin's land grab, Zelensky wants fast-track NATO membership. We cannot allow Zelensky and NATO, and with the Ukraine and NATO. That puts us at in a firing war with a nuclear-armed Russia. It's suicide on both sides. It's absolutely crazy. So this is the kind of thing, we hear the pumping up of Zelensky as a hero and fighting off those invading Russians and all this stuff. What's more important from a foreign policy position is not to say we're right. It's just to say, how do you get to a peaceful solution? And you don't hear any of that with these people. Anthony Blinken, I mean, it's one of the worst Secretary of States in history. And he looks like an SNL extra or something. I mean, this guy's just sitting there, shell-shocked, no plans, nothing. And then all you ever hear them talk about, we've seen the incredible sabotage of the pipeline recently. If those things come back to the United States, that's an act of war. That's putting the entire country on a World War III footing, with a very powerful nation that's aligned with China. So, it's a disastrous, kamikaze, psychotic foreign policy. And so when you see Biden stumbling around on the podium and walking away and people laugh at him, it's really not funny, because whoever is pulling the strings is goading us into World War III. So we really have to be on top of that and let our congressional representatives, the senators, and everybody else know this is not what we're going to support. And there shouldn't be any more money for Ukraine under these circumstances at all, except humanitarian aid. They should be put in a position where they develop the incentive to have a peace treaty with Russia, because that's what they're going to need, because Russia's going to win. That's the inevitable outcome. They're a better military, they're a more powerful nation. And is this going to be Vietnam, where we just keep providing arms and eventually troops, or is it going to be all out war? I mean, it's beyond insane. And so it's just been festering there in the background, and it's picking up steam. But anyway, from the Wall Street Journal, Ukraine's President Zelensky said Friday that Ukraine would apply for membership of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization through an expedited process. It's ridiculous. And for him, this is a real psychopathic move, because he knows it creates World War III. So especially fast track, you're in the middle of a war, and NATO is automatically bound if any of their members are being shot at to shoot back. So that's us. So the minute he gets his NATO authorization, then that puts us, legally by treaty obligated to fire at Russia. That's ridiculous. I mean, it's really crazy. I can't explain to you just how over the edge they've got. And, they're just kind of humming this off in the media oh, that Putin, he annexed whatever, and so we need to give fast track motion and threaten them with nuclear arms. You're crazy. These people are nuts. We're not going to shoot nuclear weapons. God no, we don't even know the repercussions. And you can't engage in a nuclear war with Russia. This is insanity, and it's a neocon's wet dream, and we really need to shut these guys down. Okay, so he applies for an expedited process. And this is his quote: "We are de facto allies. This has already been achieved," he said. In other words, you should be fighting for me and engage the world in World War III, all because I won't give these pieces back to Russia. And, that's not a desirable situation, but neither is World War III. So you're going to have to engage in some kind of peace process instead of just having us give you billions and billions of dollars and engage the United States in war that we don't need and is not in our best interest. And honestly, I think our aid in relation to Ukraine at this point should be humanitarian. So Mr. Zelensky also rejected Russia's annexation of Ukrainian territory in a video address on Friday afternoon, and he met with top military and security leaders to discuss ways of countering Russia's supposed annexation. The Ukrainian president's office said, the entire territory of our country will be liberated from the enemy not only of Ukraine, but also of life itself, humanity, law, and the truth. Look, Ukraine has good reason to hate Russia and vice versa, you know, so that stuff, we've seen it before. It's like the Israeli-Palestinian situation. And so we have to have a definite policy of peace in relation to that. I mean, Ukraine's pretty far away. Are we going to engage American troops for Ukraine? This just, you know, strikes me as beyond insane. And it's the invitation to nuclear war. And then you have to wonder, who's cooking that up? Who wants to see nuclear weapons used? So we have to be really hardcore with our own representatives on this. No more money for Ukraine until there's a real peace process in place and they're willing to do something. Because, you know, just giving them billions of dollars, God knows that's probably just money laundering at this point. And it doesn't belong in any aspect of America's foreign policy.